The refreshment what? Yeah, we can do that later. It's fine. The stream is continuing.
All right, so we should be streaming. This is the most fun I've ever had in a silent room.
What's that supposed to mean? He's checking his Discord right now.
I apologize in advance. All right, so welcome to Redblood Radio. Live stream offline. Oh, it says it's live.
Oh, it's. I think it's an indication that we were once online,
Yeah, probably.
but now Death Grips is really online.
Stop. All right, so here's our live stream for the day. We got a small palette of content, some important issues that we're just going to give our hot takes on, try to give as much information as we possibly can. Sorry, I was looking at something. So topics that we're going to start with is we're gonna go right into it. Basically, a quick description of the radio is that the whole goal we had when we were thinking about this is that I was like, hey, dude, you're a huge communist, and I'm not. And yet we can still respectfully talk about that. So it's like, I see a lot of these discussion, dialogue, and debunking videos, and I love them, but a lot of them are so harsh in such a comedic sense that it turns anyone away from them. And yeah, they're right that most of the people they're talking against aren't going to watch the videos and aren't willing to have a dialogue, but there are quite a few people who follow those people who 100% will have a dialogue, but they're so insulted that they refuse to look at it. I'm the biggest example of that.
Before, I think almost, what was it, like Lacey Green was like, hey, we should actually talk to each other. I think it was completely barren concept in its entirety. And then pretty much right after Lacey Green said that, she was willing to actually speak to people after she went off her, 2-month hiatus or something like that. But after that, you kind of noticed a lot of the skeptic YouTubers were kind of like, all right, well, I'm kind of done with the whole debunking ponage videos. Maybe we should have actual discussions, which I think was great. But
you still see quite a bit, the more popular ones are less willing to have a dialogue and are more still debunking.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that they're not willing to, it's just that they're not equipped to actually have a discussion. So with that, we have some quite controversial topics, some of them more known, some of them lesser known, just kind of for shits and giggles.
Yeah.
The first topic we're going to talk about is net neutrality, because as you're all aware, net neutrality has been a hot topic within the last couple of years, specifically this year. We're coming into a fully inflamed, inflammatory, very destructive discourse about how everyone who thinks that net neutrality is bad is a fucking fascist who wants to control the internet and is pure evil and stupid, and there's just a lot of shit slinging on both sides, but it's more prevalent in the left just because they're winning this argument in the eyes of the public. In the eyes of Congress, in the eyes of the state, in the eyes of most of the rest of the world, I
think probably the main reason that they're winning so much is that nobody who's actually for repealing net neutrality seems to try and defend the decision, despite the fact that there are literally defensible points. As in, they just won't say anything about it.
It's to the point where proponents who are against net neutrality, proponents who support having a trade commission but not a government institution, are so exasperated by it that they won't even dignify a response. And I can understand that, but the reason why it's becoming more and more prevalent as the years go on is because, when this debate started back in 2008, it wasn't as inflammatory as we might like to think it was. It was still a controversial thing, but most people, because they weren't informed, were less willing to speak on the subject. Now anybody with an opinion is going to talk about net neutrality, and the truth is that,
for example, our friend Caleb, he was talking about he's still in high school, and when he was in high school, the day of it being announced that net neutrality was going to be repealed or something like that, every single person in his entire school was just net neutrality is what he described to me. And I was like, well, yeah, of course, because they've all been misinformed.
So what we're going to talk about first off is what net neutrality is. Net neutrality, as it exists, isn't allow or disallow governments and institutions and companies from moderating, controlling, or selectively targeting individuals. It's actually more expensive for them to do so, even if you are talking about, for instance, economics and whatnot. Yeah. I see that I have latency issues, Chase. Give me 1 second.
I guess that's a low latency is probably a better idea, simply because we don't have any video to be streaming.
All right, we're not actually streaming any video. Is the audio okay? Do I have a nod yes or no on this? If you actually nodded, that's not helpful, Chase. Okay, so the audio is coming, but the video isn't. Well, the video is just a still image, so we're not concerned about that. Maybe when we actually edit this in post and do cameras, it'll be a concern, but at this moment we're actually running at ultra low latency, just so that if you interact with us in the direct chat and not through my Discord, I can instantly see your messages in live chat.
But
moving on.
What net neutrality is not is basically anything that the leftists said that it is.
And
pretty much what
not having net neutrality isn't gonna, like, their concept of what net neutrality is that it's gonna protect you, is that it's gonna prevent you from being discriminated against. It doesn't exist for that. It exists as kind of a catch-all in case of discrimination. The problem with that is that discrimination doesn't mean what they think it means. Discrimination means that you selectively choose which people have access to your resource. The examples of where discrimination has been really good is, for instance, peer-to-peer sharing. Peer-to-peer sharing is a hell on bandwidth. It's not necessarily the download speed, because it's essentially the same. Yeah. It's just that with how many people are using it and how many people are getting the files, especially with BitTorrent and uTorrent and so on and so forth. Torrenting, even when done legally, because of the process by which it downloads and then seeds, and what seeding does is it releases a stream of code that everyone has BitTorrent has access to. That's the issue, is that then every single person downloading it, it's not the downloads that are concerned, it's the actual bandwidth on the peer-to-peer.
Yes. So before net neutrality became a thing back in like late 2014, early 2015 or something like that, the way the internet was before, you tend to notice that a lot of companies, when it came to bandwidth issues, just kind of talked to each other about it. Like, for example, there was a deal, what was it, Verizon, I think, made a deal with BitTorrent?
It was Verizon, or I believe it was AT&T and BitTorrent. I might be wrong.
Okay. Yeah, somebody made a deal with BitTorrent, essentially, and what they addressed was, BitTorrent was like, hey, we're a website, we just came out, and, our connection's been behaving really slowly, and, the company, the internet company, which, as we said, we're not too sure exactly what it was like, well, you occupy a lot of bandwidth, and until you fix that issue, we're going to slow you because you're taking too much money for what you're worth.
So the deal was that in exchange for them, conversing and having a dialogue and treating things on a case-by-case basis, they determined that they could afford to give BitTorrent the bandwidth if BitTorrent wouldn't pay for a monthly premium. Instead, it would pay on a commission rate. So the amount of profits that they actually make from BitTorrent go partially to the overall holding company. And while many people might see that as exploitation or a pseudo-feudalist thing, it's not, because in order for them to provide you quality internet care, they're going to have
they need to have bandwidth, and in order for BitTorrent to be able to provide you with the files that you need, they also need to have bandwidth. The thing is that bandwidth is ultimately a resource. If you invite a bunch of people over and everybody asks for the Wi-Fi password, and everybody's watching YouTube videos or streaming or something at your house at a party or something, you've got like 20 people in there, nobody's going to be able to do anything on the internet because they're occupying all the bandwidth, unless of course you have internet router and service that's set up for that, but most people don't. Usual package is what, like 4 or 5?
4 to 5
like
people
that's
is typically what they consider to be the family.
Yeah, But
the more you add, the cheaper it gets, but that's also because...
Just think of that on a company-wide scale. So, let's say in this area they have a tower here and, 5 million people use that tower or something like that. If somebody is, say like, of those 5 million people, 500,000 are using BitTorrent on the daily. And that is causing the other 4.5 million people to have their internet speeds lowered because BitTorrent occupies more bandwidth. So ultimately, what it's about is less blocking websites because, that you didn't buy that internet package, which is what the liberals tend to think that it is. They're always like, basically their main empty argument is that, once net neutrality gets repealed, internet service companies will be able to divide what websites you are and are not allowed to view into packages. So, you buy the Netflix package, and that gives you Netflix and other streaming websites. You didn't buy the YouTube package, so you can't use YouTube anymore. No, that's not based in reality. That's not based in anything about the science of economics. That is not based in anything about how to run a company.
What the biggest places they point to that do these website-based tracking and so on and so forth, those internet companies are partially owned by the government, and because of that, it's not the internet service provider itself, but it's the actual internet systems only allow you to use specific sites, so they're able to charge you for them, and that's fine, and that costs just as much because of how much regulation they're pouring into it. It costs them a lot already. Spending a little bit more to divide, you spending $5 on something isn't going to cost them more or less. Now, on the other hand, when you talk about, for instance, you're talking about, in America, they're going to start throttling specific sites or for specific people. It's going to destroy this or that. Well, the thing is that because it's not a government thing, it's really hard to throttle specific sites and specific things. In fact, the websites that are claiming this is going to happen, like the bigger proponents supporting net neutrality like Netflix, first of all, are exempt from net neutrality laws like Apple, like Netflix. If they support these laws because they're international companies, they're not affected by American courts. So
and they will absolutely cripple the competition.
They will
That
destroy it all.
That is why there is such a huge push from the left to keep net neutrality as it is, because it's funded by things like Google and like Netflix, because they don't have to listen to net neutrality because it doesn't apply to them because their companies aren't based in America.
And to point out that this isn't just saying, they do benefit from it and that's just a side effect. The Netflix knows this, and the way that we know Netflix knows this is that during this deal between Netflix and AT&T, and AT&T is anti-net neutrality and was trying to propose that Netflix would pay more for their bandwidth because Netflix uses...
I thought it was Comcast.
It was Comcast. Apologies. So Comcast was saying, you're going to pay more because you use a ton of our bandwidth and it costs us a lot of money to keep your streaming service alive. And Netflix said, okay, let's discuss it. And as they were doing discussions, there was this big controversy because it was revealed by Netflix based upon some very limited statistics that up until the moment that they signed the contract, apparently it had made it look like Comcast had been throttling them so that they didn't have any bandwidth. Well, it turned out...
in actuality, Netflix was the one who had been purposefully slowing down internet speeds on Comcast's network to try and make them look bad.
Netflix had actually contacted a person inside of the peer-to-peer sharing to actually set it up so that they would get empty packages of information. That way it would look like they were throttling internet and lowering the actual broadcasting speeds. So what we experienced as consumers is that Netflix was streaming at a much lower rate. The truth is it was streaming at the same rate. It was just that half of the information they were streaming was literally empty, and they were doing it on purpose to make Comcast look bad. And that's exactly the point, is that you can make the argument that a company might make a decision based upon political policy on the basis of morality, and that's fine because a lot of companies do, even when it isn't beneficial for them. But in this situation, not only is it beneficial, but it's been shown that Netflix has been willfully malevolent to their own customers in order to ensure that something good happens to this. So right now they're talking about repealing Obama-era regulations for net neutrality. And...
Can I add a little bit of something about what they're actually repealing here?
Yeah.
All right, so here's the thing, is that everybody thinks that the entirety of net neutrality is being repealed, which would include things like transparency. And transparency is essentially they legally cannot lie to you about what you're receiving in your internet packages and everything. People tend to think that that's what's being repealed, but to my knowledge, it's actually just Title II, which is the Obama-era net neutrality. It's only Title II net neutrality being repealed. And here's what Title II does. Originally, the way that net neutrality worked under just, what was it, the steady push or something like that. Basically, the original net neutrality around like Clinton era or something like that. What that was, that included transparency and everything like that. But the Title II net neutrality, the only thing that that did was it made it so that the FTC no longer has anything to do with the internet. Rather, what Title II net neutrality does is it makes all internet services count legally as telecommunication services instead of information services. And so basically how the internet worked before
Bruce Rauner unleashed
like something like 2014 or something like that. What happened was, here's how it would work. The FCC made laws about the internet, about what was allowed to happen, and that's tied into the original Title I net neutrality, like transparency, things like that. Transparency is the real big important one, which is why I keep saying it. But FCC would make the laws, and the FTC would investigate on a case-to-case basis whether or not companies had violated any terms that the FCC set. So FCC says, you can't do this if consumers on a certain internet service provider say, hey, I've been experiencing this, then the FTC comes in and says, hey, consumers are saying that you've done this, and they cited this evidence. Stop that, or we'll shut down your company. And in most cases, the mere mention of the FTC getting involved, the mere call to court was enough to curb any kind of bad behavior. So I think you'll notice
that a lot of leftists say that if we went to a trade commission as opposed to a court, if we went to a trade commission which would audit you and make sure that you were performing in the specific instance in a specific way correctly, that if we went to an FTC and we went to civil court as opposed to criminal court, that we would end up having an oligarchy, that internet companies would suddenly be really easily able to do these things because they would have the best lawyers because of the amount of money they have. But what you actually see is that based upon the actual history of the United States, since the internet has come into contact, every single time the FTC is brought up, the internet, everyone backs down. The only companies that try to negotiate and argue with the FTC are also
Verizon.
It's
I think
actually
was one of them.
Verizon and Apple are the biggest ones. Apple is a really big proponent that argues a lot with the FTC, and the reasoning is because they're an international company, so they don't believe that they should be subject to the same whims of our national community.
Which is why I'm sure Apple very much so supports net neutrality, because now what Title II net neutrality did was it made it so that, as I said before, all internet service providers are considered telecommunications instead of information services, which puts them purely under the jurisdiction of the FCC. Now, what this does is it bloats the work of the FCC. Now the FCC has twice as much to worry about, not just from companies like Verizon, but also from companies like Comcast. So now the FCC has to take care of two topics, as well as a couple of other conditions like that. But ultimately, the FTC has no job in the internet anymore, at least up until now. I hope that they bring the FTC back into the internet service for sure. But you'll note that any and all internet growth has occurred within the Title I net neutrality area. What was the last change to the internet that you noticed between like 2015 and now?
I'll wait.
But like ultimately, here's the thing:
it's the honest to goodness truth is that when you actually look at the history and the statistics of it, most companies are more scared of the FTC than they are the government. The reason is because most companies have more sway over the government because of things like, for instance, lobbyists. I mean, the entire reason why net neutrality seems so appealing to most people is because Verizon, Apple, Netflix has just poured money into the PR campaign that is make people who support getting rid of net neutrality look like they're fucking stupid. And that's the honest to goodness truth, because the man who originally coined the term net neutrality used to actually concede that in almost every case regarding FTC, they favored in the case of the person who was suing, not the company. And yet, the same guy now, when presented with a Google debate that he was supposed to do about net neutrality, laughed in derision at the concept that the FTC could ever work, that if we don't have government enforcing this law, we won't follow it. The thing with trade commissions and the things with commissions in general is that you have an association of businesses that are really high quality, that apply to themselves to really hard standards that most companies can't follow. And they all get together and say, what things would hurt our customers the most? What things would prevent us from getting the most amount of money from our customers?
Because when it comes to a Federal Trade Commission, it's about the consumer, not about the citizen. So, for example, if you were to take it from the perspective of the FCC, it's what is causing our taxpayers the most trouble. But when it comes to the FTC, it's what is driving people away from business. Because the government doesn't actually need to worry about business. They get paid taxes whichever way. So I guess rather than saying what is causing our taxpayers trouble, I guess they should say, why are we supposed to care?
Just because of the simplicity that is our deficit spending, the government doesn't have to be concerned about a specific budget. They'll talk a lot about a budget, but yet no matter who you put in charge, they're always going to increase the spending, and that's the exact problem. Is that government is not very good at economy, and it's not to slander the government. It's to just outright say, when government has to handle things, they spend a lot more money trying to do the same things that people did with businesses, and they do so less efficiently, and when they make a mistake, which they often do, it affects everyone stratified. It's a systematic stratified thing where if a business makes a mistake, maybe 100,000 out of the 220 million people are affected, and that's a lot of people. But when the government makes a mistake, it's 1 in 4 Americans. It's half the population. It's an entire group that they're trying to help, and that's the issue, is that when a company says, oh, how can we help X group of people? How can we help our consumers in X way? They target something, and if it goes wrong, they have to pay for it. Government doesn't have to. The government should, but it just doesn't have to. The government should,
but it most certainly will not.
So with that, I think we've covered the subject of net neutrality pretty well. I think the only other thing to say, if you want to talk a bit about what other governments look like without net neutrality.
Yeah, so a lot of people are like, even those who are in support of, getting rid of Title II net neutrality are like, hey, as long as we have Title I, we're still fine, dude, It's like, I don't maybe necessarily agree with repealing Title II net neutrality, but at least it won't be as disastrous as everybody says. No, repeal Title I net neutrality too, because I can't remember if it was Finland or Sweden or some country up there in Scandinavia where the people are, I don't know, being cold, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if it was like in Finland, but basically the point is that once you get rid of Title I net neutrality, that allows you to privatize internet. So when you privatize the internet, that means that anybody can have access to it, because it's not the job of big corporations who have been appointed by the government to deal with these things. This means that no matter how big those corporations get, no matter how scary they are, ultimately in a place like Finland, I think I'm going to say it's Finland because I'm pretty sure that's where it was. Anybody, feel free to look it up and correct me, because, well, yeah, human error. But anyway, ultimately, no matter how big or scary a corporation gets, if they're like, okay, well, we're starting to charge you $5 just to use Netflix every month on top of the Netflix premium you pay, when this happens, I can just walk down the street to my, 2-block internet service provider named Troy or something, and just, hey, can I have some internet? Yeah, sure. It's gigabyte a second download speeds, 100 megabytes a second upload speeds, because that's what we get when you privatize internet, is that you can have people who can supply internet to just a couple blocks radius, and the internet is fast as fuck, because as we talked about before, the more people you have on an internet service, the lower everybody's speed becomes. So that's why they can have like gigabyte a second download speeds over in Finland, because they're like, yeah, we got like 100 people on this internet, and I got a tower over here or something like that. It's kind of small, but only needs to reach this area. Like, that's the thing, is that just get rid of Title I net neutrality, get the government out of the internet in general, and let the free market take hold. Because I guarantee you will see a massive change in the way that the internet functions.
I love America.
You'll see a massive change in the way that the internet functions if you repeal Title I net neutrality as well. Now, there are of course, some things to worry about, I suppose, but ultimately, even still, if you're smart as a company, if you're smart as a person who manages your company, you're not going to want to piss off your customers. So, that's the thing.
All right, so I think that would be a pretty good summary of our thing on net neutrality. Essentially, most people don't know what they're talking about. That's not their fault. They're being heavily misled.
Brainwash.
The companies that are misleading them are outright malicious to their own consumers and exempt
things
from
that
the
they are
laws that they're advocating
don't even
for.
apply to them.
And in the long run, having a free market for the internet has always been beneficial, regardless as to whether or not you agree in free markets in general. In terms of the internet's history, especially in America, the free market, especially during Title I growth, was way faster than anything else.
Yeah.
So our next topic is espionage, and this is I couldn't find any substantiative sources for this. I found a lot of different sources covering it, but none of them that I would consider to be reliable. I also found that Snopes doesn't have anything on it, but Snopes typically takes a while to catch up on things just because
they actually take their time to look at everybody else.
Right, they're actually real journalists as opposed to everything else in the world today.
They don't just, put something out as soon as they have a fancy headline. They're just like, okay, well, wait, we're going to put out something when we have the truth.
So this article here says that Germany is suspending visas for Cambodian government members over a crackdown. Now, what exactly happened, according to this article, is that Cambodian immigrants supposedly were trying to overthrow the German government with support from the U.S. military.
Which,
if that's true, right, that's insane. And the worst part is that even if it's not true, it's entirely believable because of how the CIA and the FBI have operated for the last 50 years of their existence.
I'm going to put in a little pin, because I was reading a different article when we were looking for things to talk about, and pertaining to the U.S., I think this might actually be something very interesting. An article that I read but didn't save. You continue.
Okay. And then the other one, this is actually an article I found on Yahoo, so a little more substantiated, if not still clickbaity, says that Cambodia is suspending its U.S. MIA searches for the visa ban.
So essentially what Germany first did was, because they suspected, and, of course, the Cambodian government denied, but Germany suspected they were trying to undermine their country, and so they just banned the visas to Germany of all the Cambodian government officials, and to which the Cambodian government was basically like, we won't die if we can't go to Germany, which... Get fucking roasted, Germany.
Also, to add on to this, it's also saying that the U.S. has imposed visa bans on Cambodia,
which is very strange.
Which implies a lot of different things. I would be tentative to respond to this, but I think that if it's true, if it's completely substantiated, then the truth of the situation is that the government did something really stupid, and in response to doing something stupid, they were caught. And in order to save face, they said, "Okay, we're gonna cut ties with you."
We are also cutting ties with.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even suspect that. I don't think the Cambodians care if they are going to America either at that point. If we're just directly helping them, so it's a phone call away there, Trump. But ultimately, I think. Possibly, if they were really working together, United States and Cambodia, they might even just say, hey, U.S., got a cop-out for you, just ban us too.
All right, so that was...
Before we move on to the next topic, though,
okay.
The other thing I had to add was, this is why we shouldn't fucking get involved in foreign policy. I literally, the article I was talking about, I forget exactly what it was, but it was a specific group of Muslims in a country. I cannot for the life of me remember, and I don't have the article in front of me. But basically what it was saying was they're being massacred. There's genocide going against a specific group or race of Muslims, and people are just like, why isn't the United States doing anything about this? To which I just have to say, do you know how
you know what
Al-Qaeda
happened
or
in
ISIS,
Iraq?
Came to be?
Do you know what happened in Iraq? Do you know what happened in Afghanistan? That militant supremacist groups, and we went in and said, all right, we're going to solve this problem. We trained other minority groups to fight against this, and what happened
Send in
was...
our own troops and then withdraw them after we had trained enough
and
people
those
from their
people
side.
became the militants that we're still fighting today. Those people became the extremists that we're still fighting today.
So the reason that we're not going to go, that we shouldn't go into another country to stop, genocide from happening in there is because every single time we do that, we destabilize the region, and everybody blames accurately America. So we create more enemies every time that we try to obliterate people, because we don't like what we're doing.
Here's the issue with conquering, okay? The biggest issue with conquering is the power vacuum. In ancient times, it was really easy to deal with a power vacuum because if you instituted a military power, the likelihood that anyone could fight against that power was very low. We now live in a world where, despite gun control, despite all movements against it, people can have guns, legally or illegally. So if you go into a country, overthrow what you believe is a dictator, and place in a surrogate or allow them to have a democratic election, whoever is voted or placed by you is going to be opposed by the majority of people because even if they agree with overthrowing the old leader, they're going to see it as a new form of fascism, and they're going to violently fight against that. The issue with that is that then you have a power vacuum. Then you have a series where there's no government, there's no market, there's no power. It's just a bunch of different people with varying degrees of weapons and armor and influence who are deciding what's going to happen. So what happens is a bunch of people who have a bunch of weapons and believe very strongly that they're right just take power, and nothing can stop them from that moment forward. And that's the reason why...
The reason that they have guns and are able to take the power is because we gave them to them.
And that's exactly the issue, is that we keep
because
going into
here's the thing,
countries and we keep training who we think is being oppressed by who we think is the oppressor, and we're not wrong in that moment. Mm-hmm. But in that moment, we give the oppressed the power to become the oppressor, and they take it.
Yes, and ultimately it is a very sad thing. I don't mean to delegitimize the plights of those people who are being massacred. I think that's fucking awful. It's terrible. But if we go in there just to bail them out, give them guns, and say, hey, you can do it, ultimately what happens when they're done? Well, They think, now we have guns and power, and we're still fucking pissed. Who can we turn our attention to now?
Well, even worse so is that if you go around and you tell them, oh, you live under fascism, if you just go democratic, everything's going to get better. That's not true. It takes hard work. And so when you give a bunch of people a bunch of weapons and they take control of a government and then things don't get better immediately, they assume that it's your fault.
And even still, in the majority of the cases, I think even after we help them establish a new government, we still try to control it.
And that's...
to my knowledge, that's what happened with... Shit, what was it? I forget. I don't know. But,
Good one.
Yeah, I got him. Anyway, I think that's kind of what happened with France.
That's what happened with France and Germany.
Not with France and Germany, with France and Vietnam, I think. In southern Vietnam. Is it southern or northern? I think, because I know the North Koreans
Vietnam
not...
was Viet Cong.
Yeah, okay. Whichever the case, the good Vietnam by...
whatever.
Yeah, whatever
Communist
the case,
Vietnam versus not communist Vietnam.
Communist Vietnam versus American dictatorship Vietnam.
Fascist.
Yeah, essentially, once we bailed them out, we instituted a new government in Vietnam that was so much worse than what they had previously, and it was a huge, essentially government PR disaster. Really, good image to think of that is the democratically elected official that we ourselves appointed as dictator of southern Vietnam was such a fucking Christian fanatic that it's a really famous picture. A Buddhist monk sat
Lit
in the middle
himself
of
on
a street
fire.
and fucking burned himself to death without
To the
screaming.
point
He
that
didn't,
his heart and bones crystallized from the heat of the fire.
yes.
He poured gasoline on his body and without screaming lit himself on fire and just sat there in
meditating
protest.
and died.
He was known. The amount of cruelty that the dictator had is similar to that of Nero of Rome. He literally, just as Nero would walk down the streets and persecute and beat the fucking Christians, this man would beat, persecute, rape, and destroy the lives of anyone who wasn't Christian,
and
mainly
we
Buddhists.
put him there
And
because
we
was
put
under
him
our
there because he said that he
is
was a
probably
capitalist and we knew he was a Christian, and that was good
Yes.
enough for us.
And that probably was what created a lot of the conflict in Vietnam to begin with, was that the people and that's the way communism always starts out in most countries, or at least, supposed labeled communism. We're going to call it communism for that sake. The way that kind of socialism always works out is it turns out really well at first because they overthrew a government that sucked and everybody's happy because everybody's getting stuff. Imagine how yummy North Vietnam looked to South Vietnam, especially for the Buddhists, even moderate Buddhists or anything like that, not necessarily monks, but conditions were so bad that a monk literally killed himself.
Keeping in mind that the entire Buddhist philosophy is built upon the concept that suffering is caused by wanting things. Ergo, if one does not want something, they cannot suffer. So most Buddhists accept death if it's inflicted upon them by a willing soul, because they understand that soul is ultimately destroying itself more than it's destroying his own. And Buddhists is that the Buddhist may be upset that he has to die, but he knows that he'll live on in his belief. Whereas
is he even necessarily upset that he's dying? I mean, he doesn't want to live necessarily.
And so the entire concept is that these people who are trained from birth not to want anything, to believe that wanting is harmful to themselves, and so on and so forth, were persecuted and treated so badly that they literally would have rather set themselves on fire than live another day in their own country.
Yeah, and
that's
why
what
we
did to
don't
Vietnam.
get involved in other countries' affairs, because they're other countries. We should defend ourselves and the principles we believe in our own country.
That doesn't mean applying those principles to other countries. That doesn't mean doing another
as sad
Red
as it
Scare.
is, as fucked up as it can be.
As sad as it genuinely is to look at a country that has destroyed its own economy.
Because
you don't go in there just because they've made a mistake and say, oh, we're going to make everything better, because one of two things happens. We either funk it all up, or they become so dependent on us that when we do have to leave, that funks everything up.
Yeah.
We can't continue to do that. If we want to do something helpful, if we want to be helpful, then we go over there and we try to teach them. We have diplomatic relations with them. We're willing to have industry with them, but that's where it ends. You don't give them free stuff. You don't give them guns. You don't train them how to fight. You teach them how to do business. You teach them how to be respectful, and you leave them alone. That's the biggest thing, is you have to let them to their own devices so that they can learn what works for them in their environment. Anyways.
Before we move on to the next topic, I gotta pee real bad for pretty much the entirety of this discussion. So, or at least the discussion on the last topic there.
38 minutes in, and we're already taking our first break. I don't have elevator music. I'm real sorry.
I'm just taking a pee break. It's fine. This is probably going to be loud. Let us know in the comments if it was loud.
Something was making your mics peak? Well, that's awesome.
For how long, though?
Why are you not using the live stream chat? Small variance. Oh, right now, when he said this is probably going to be loud, it's not disabled. It literally says it's not. I literally have live chat on, dude. I'll see if this fixed it. Did that fix it? See? Did you see that?
And we're back. That's my spinal column.
Okay, there we go.
Moose man.
All right. So our next topic is about unions, because something really, really interesting is happening. This actually isn't an article, this is a video, and basically, long story short, right, if you work in any government job, they have unions. That's fine. No one has a problem with unions existing. I mean, people do, but we don't listen to those people
Because they're fucking communists. Kidding.
No, they're nationalists.
Yeah, that's
Anyway.
Anyway.
So the thing is that the problem with unions, as so far as we see them today, is that you don't get an option. If you are a teacher in public or government, not public schools, that's not a fair term, government schools,
Yeah.
you are expected to be part of a union. Many people are outright told, after their year is up, that they need to renew their union status, even if they don't want to. Now, a lot of people may ask, why would you not want to, sign with the union? They give you a bunch of money, so on and so forth. Well, one of the things with unions is that they try to treat all of their employees the same. And what that leads to is it leads to a lot of teachers who work really, really hard being treated the same as teachers who don't work as hard.
Yeah.
And it's just this very, very socialistic system in its conception, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. People have the choice of what they want to participate in. The problem is that there's only one union, and you have to be a part of it.
Yes.
Now, what they're talking about doing right now, because originally they had a case where a woman refused to join a union. She still wanted to be a teacher, but she was refusing to join the union, and they took it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And, there's 7 Supreme Court justices, and 3 of them were in support of it, 4 of them were against it, so they were going to win. And then that 4th Supreme Court justice died. So they lost the case. So it went into a mistrial, and because, that's how laws work, because it was a mistrial and there was no actual verdict on it, because it was such a tie, because it was mistrial because of the death, the unions are still allowed to force teachers to pay for their dues. So now they're doing a new one. There's another guy who is doing a whole new one, and it looks like they might actually win out on this. And what that means is not all unions, but simply teaching unions, it might no longer be required of you to pay into a union. You still can, you still have the option, but you're no longer required to. Now, what's cool about that is that's one step towards an even better thing that they could do, and I'm really hoping within the next 5 to 10 years that it becomes common, and that's to choose multiple unions, to choose which union you'd like to be a part of. Because right now, if they pass this law, you can say, no, I don't want to be a part of the union, I'd like to be a non-union person, I'd like to make my own contract, because that's what a union is, right? Is an agreement with you and your employer is that you sit down and they show you their contract and you say, I agree with all of this except for this, can we change this? And you have a conversation about that, and you can negotiate the terms of your contract. What a union is that they guarantee you a really good contract, but you sign the same contract as everyone else.
Yeah, and so it cannot be changed at all.
So it can't be changed. And the thing with that is that, well, like I said, most people have
say that the needs of the people will never change.
Right, exactly. Different teachers have different needs. Different teachers have different performances. So when you ask the question, why wouldn't you want to be a part of a union? Well, there's a multitude of reasons, but the ultimate reason is that even if I want to be a part of a union, I shouldn't be forced to be a part of one.
Exactly.
So that's a really good step that they're making, and I hope that it does pass with colors and that it does really well. But then it gets even better, because then I don't disagree with the idea of a union, because the idea of a union is it's essentially juxtaposition of the rights of the workers versus...
It's like a mini government almost. It sets standards for a specific group.
In the terms of the checks and balances system that is necessary for a truly democratic society, it's a collective. And the thing is that there's nothing wrong with a collective democracy. The issue with a collective democracy is when no one gets a choice.
Yes.
And so...
And that is one of my biggest things when it comes to most government and unions and stuff like that, is that I don't disagree that government should be allowed to provide people with benefits based off tax dollars. I just don't think that it's fair that everybody has to pay into it, because that's a in a quick aside here, that's a lot of things that right-wing people are like, it's like, I don't have a problem with you having access to birth control or health care or whatnot, just I don't want to pay for it.
Well,
And I
that's the
think
thing
that-
is,
I
I
think
wouldn't
that-
even mind necessarily paying for these things. Like, I
Yeah.
wouldn't mind to pay, if I was standing in line and there were like 10 people there, and each of them was like, "Hey, will you give me $2 for helping women get birth control for cheaper, or helping make sure that architects are
Yeah,
paid a
but
good
it should
amount
be
for
your
government
decision.
jobs?" I would love to do that. I would
Yeah.
more than willingly give my dollar to help
in my
someone.
perfect high welfare-ish government system, I think that that's how you vote. Not necessarily like you can elect your officials and everything like that, but that's how you vote with your taxes.
And that's
I think that
exactly
could
the
be
thing,
great.
is that it's like, with me and money, it's like, the reason why I have a problem with welfare laws isn't because the concept of welfare, even though I have some stipulations. My problem with the concept
can
of
be
welfare
dangerous.
laws is that it creates this idea that everyone has to pay into it, you don't get a choice, and
Not everybody receives the benefits.
not everybody receives the benefits, and that's the biggest thing.
And not everybody needs to receive the benefits as well.
For instance, I know my mother's watching this, and I remember that during my childhood, we would have this constant problem where if you were working a couple of different jobs and making a good amount of money, you would get just over the poverty line, and we'd lose some of our government benefits, and then we'd be spending more money, so we wouldn't be able to afford anything else.
Yeah.
We would essentially be poorer because we were making more money.
Which
and that's my
is
stipulation with welfare,
counterintuitive.
is that
It only applies to a specific thing, and it's
so specific and yet so broad, because for instance then people like Bailey get money when they're absolutely awful. Now we're not going to go too much into detail because it's kind of a personal matter, but long story short, this
imagine being so terrible just in everything that you do that it actually benefits you.
imagine you doing something so illegal that the government hires a gang to get you, and then the government
just to
turns
get you
around.
to stop. They're like, we will literally pay for everything if you just stop.
And that's pretty much the problem, is that what welfare does modernly is it steals money from a bunch of people who may not be able to pay for it, or may not want to pay for it, or may not just maybe just they don't want to have a gun pointed to their head and tell them that you have to pay for this. And then it gives it to people, not the people who actually need it, not the people who are actually trying, but the people who don't need it, aren't trying, and don't deserve it. And that's the big stipulation. I disagree with welfare for all sorts of other reasons, but the biggest reason is just because it's
The way
completely
that we
unfair.
it's so poorly executed in this country that it's actually harmful.
And that's exactly the thing. Is like, for instance, there's a type of welfare that I think is a very interesting thing, and that's the Alaska Dividend Fund. And what they do with that is that because most of the oil in the country comes from Alaska, the oil companies in Alaska make a ton of money, and the population of Alaska is very small. So, okay, I don't know why that is. So what happens is you pay all into your taxes and you get your tax refund, and then every year everybody in the entire country gets a flat amount from the taxes that are taken from the oil company. And the reasoning they do that is because it's in libertarian market economies, right? In economies where we don't believe that government should have control over the market, so on and so forth, there's a big concern about natural resources.
Yeah.
Private property as it extends to natural resources. Well, the left-leaning version of that is that if you take something from nature, whatever you give up has to be of equal value to what you took. So if you're taking more land or more of the natural resources than everyone else, then you have to pay for it. And it's your choice of whether or not you agree with that. I don't necessarily, but it's still pretty admirable because this oil company,
at least it tries to compensate for something.
The oil company provides oil to the entire country, and they pay out maybe $2 million each year to support a bunch of different people.
Which, if you're selling the majority of probably one of the most important resources in one of the biggest countries in the world, I don't think that's necessarily a problem.
Right, and that's exactly the thing, is that most people make, $1,400 from that dividend. Wow. I mean, that's a good amount of money for an individual person, but when you think about how many people are in Alaska, that's not a lot of money in comparison to how much those companies are making. So that's my
Plus,
thing.
like,
Is that
I do kind of understand, especially from Alaska's perspective. I don't think you could probably be able to get away with this in certain states, but Alaska sucks to live
you
in.
couldn't do this in New York, you couldn't do this in Chicago, but you could do this in Alaska because just how small
they
the
will literally
population
pay you
is.
to move to Alaska.
Yes.
Because they want you to survive. My dad was going to move to Alaska.
So the whole thing is that with unions, everyone should be allowed to get into a union. I'd even encourage people to get into unions, especially men who are working very dangerous jobs. You have the highest mortality rate out of all of the individuals in the entire country. Do us all the favor and get in a union, because you do not want to be stuck in a situation where you've lost one of your hands from some sort of accident, and then the company is taking as long as possible to pay out. You don't want to be stuck with that. If you have a union, they'll have your back. On the other hand, like I said, as much as I encourage people to be in unions,
and it should be your choice.
You don't have a choice, and you should. You should have the choice of whether or not you want a union at all, and if you do want a union, you should have the choice of which union you want, because a union contract is a collective contract. It's something everyone agrees to. You might get a bunch of benefits, but you don't get to decide small nuances. There might be sub-packages, but you don't get to negotiate your own terms. And if you have more than one union, then there's more diversity in that choice. And if you don't have to choose a union, it's even better.
And who's to say that even unions have to not have that contract kind of basis? Like, who's to say that unions shouldn't have a flexible
right, exactly. If a
conditions.
union could work a lot like a temp hiring agency, where you actually work for the company and you do get a genuine contract. You are employed by the company, but they draw up your actual, they show you what their base contract is that most people take, and then you say, well, I have specific stipulations, and they'll negotiate with those people on your behalf. That's fine. You still shouldn't be forced to do it, and you should have diversity and choice. And that's the biggest concern that I have about unions.
Yeah.
So, like I said, hopefully Stossel's right, and we win this case so that, if you're a teacher or a government student or a government school employee, you don't have to be a part of a union. And if you don't, that'll be great. It'll be really good for teachers' rights. Now we're going to talk about Justin Trudeau. This is a bit of a joke one because...
Because Justin Trudeau.
Justin Trudeau's kind of a joke. We all know it, but he's a very scary man because
we don't all know it.
Canada doesn't seem to know it.
At the end of this, can I add my little question that I had about the legality of
Yes, you go ahead and do
of
that,
speech?
because that is definitely something I'm concerned about. So
Can
for
we
those
put,
of you,
a pin in that, so I remember.
Right.
We just
yeah, you can actually write that down there. So my biggest concern with Justin Trudeau, right? Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister of Canada. He's essentially their big president, right? So Justin Trudeau is a very, very progressive man. He's very left-leaning. He is the epitome of what social justice wants, right? And that's fine. He's allowed to have his opinions. But one of the first things he did in office is pass Bill C-16. Now, what Bill C-16 says is that if you are talking to someone and you use the pronouns that they do not have selected, you can be subjected to a fine. Here's the first thing. First of all, this is different from any other freedom of speech impeding laws. Like most laws that have to do with censorship and freedom of speech make it so you can't say specific things. Like most people probably wouldn't oppose a law that doesn't allow you to say the N-word anymore. Now, granted, okay, most people wouldn't have a moral issue with that, but there would be the whole freedom of speech argument.
Yes.
And so here's the thing, is that when you make an argument of you can't say this word anymore, people are more accepting of that simply because of the fact that they can understand the harm of the word. When you force someone, and that's what this is the law of compelled speech, you have to talk in a specific way, you reach a moment of absolute concern for everybody. Because instead of you just saying, hey, don't say that, you're saying you will say this. It is not your choice anymore. Now, you might say, well, why wouldn't you use? I would use. I just don't think that people should be forced to. And I'm more concerned about people
It's a matter of individual respect.
And furthermore, I don't even know how far this goes. If
It's
I'm talking to you for the first time, and you look like a woman, and you're dressed like a woman, and you have a very feminine voice, and I refer to you as a woman,
But your real pronouns are Splognar.
Yeah, but your real pronouns are, for instance, like Z or Zir. I'm not going to know that off the top of my head. I wouldn't even know if you were using they or he.
Because
so,
what it forces to do is a conversational icebreaker would then become, what are your pronouns?
And that's the concern for me, is that what happens when you're in an emergency situation? It's like...
Say, what are your pronouns? You. Because you can't say sir or ma'am.
So, paramedics, paramedics are already in a lot of hot water over all sorts of stuff.
Oh, yeah,
like,
because, well, see, that's the thing, is that you need to tell them your original gender if you're
you
being
need to
rescued
tell
by a
them your
paramedic,
birth sex,
because
and if
that can have effects on your health and how they can treat you.
The wider concern
And now
for a
paramedics
lot
can
of
probably
different
be sued.
philosophers right now concerning the law is what it supposes. It supposes that gender, sexuality, expression, and identity are all separate from one another, which is already a very concerning idea. But furthermore, it states that biological sex is pretty much pointless, that it's almost non-existent. And this is dangerous, because this is what has caused the, this is a huge issue.
Paramedics is a very good example. You could definitely harm somebody by convincing them that they don't have to think that they're even biologically male.
If you were a paramedic and you had two choices of medicine, one which works better on masculine hormones and one that works better on feminine hormones, and someone was androgynous but wasn't using hormones to appear androgynous, they were simply born that way.
Yeah.
Short of stripping their clothes, the only thing that you can really do to tell what their biological sex is to ask them. And if you ask them and they believe in this biological deconstructionalist view, this belief that biology is not real, it becomes concerning. Now, Trudeau has done a lot of other stuff. He's done a couple of really funny hit pieces. One of my favorite hit pieces on himself, he didn't intend it to be a hit piece on himself, but it was pretty funny.
But boy, can he not deflect the blame to anybody else, because, yeah, it's his fault. Anyway.
You go ahead.
Basically, I don't know if it was a talk or a dinner or something like that, but he accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, literally invited a foreign assassin to a meeting.
So I don't know if everyone knows this, but Justin Trudeau is currently doing some foreign diplomatic relations with India, and he's been immersing himself in their culture, and everyone's real excited about that to see. Well, no, I mean, there's a very mixed opinion on it, because some of the social justice crowd is really happy that he's participating in someone else's culture and respecting it, and some of them are upset because they think he's appropriating it. That's not the basis of this. He invited a bunch of different Indian diplomats, political people, so on and so forth, to this big dinner. One of the guys that he invited in 1989 tried to assassinate the foreign prime minister. So to put that in perspective, this would be like if Trump had somehow brought back John Wilkes Booth and invited him to dinner. This guy...
I want to have a lot of famous actors at my dinner.
He
invited
over a man who tried to assassinate the previous Indian prime minister. And that's not to talk, like, there's no morality in this, all right? There's no discussion in this. It just shows you how discombobulated his entire platform is, how just disconnected his entire system, his entire cabinet is from one another. Because
it just seems like that's something that was really easy to find out about the guy, and they didn't find that out before.
And then they were like, "Oh, we revoked his invitation." It's like, yeah, because that's how that works.
After everybody screeched,
it's just really embarrassing to him. And what's
hey,
funnier is that
political assassin, you want to come to a dinner? Skirt.
If someone else hadn't noticed, most likely he'd be dead.
Yeah.
So it's just a very humorous thing, because it shows you that between all of the different people in his cabinet and all the bodyguards and all the editors and all the public relations managers, which every political person has, somehow Justin Trudeau still made the mistake of inviting an assassin to his...
of the Indian government to a dinner with the Indian government.
It was a very interesting article. It was a very funny thing. The title of it was actually Justin Trudeau is embarrassed and regretful that he has invited him over. And that's just a bit of humor for you. It's because ultimately it's just a flub, really. But
it
it's
has
such
a little bit of
serious
political
flaw. It has
exactly.
it's a flub that's so implicative.
It's funny,
so
and
incriminating,
that's why we're sharing it.
and
But
so
there's also
dangerous.
that undertone of how exactly did you let that happen?
How did everyone let that happen? That's the
Yeah.
biggest concern, is that you have to be completely uncoordinated in order to have something like that happen. At least they were coordinated enough to catch it. At least
Yeah.
they were coordinated enough to not invite an assassin to sit with the Indian government.
Well, at least they were coordinated enough to revoke the invitation.
Right.
Of the assassin.
Okay. So, Eain proposed a question that I think is very important. So
I'll give
about
a little bit of context to it first here. So essentially, I work in a telephone answering service company. Probably can't tell you the name of the company or any of its affiliates,
no,
but I won't anyway.
wouldn't risk it.
Yeah, but basically, sometimes some of the companies, they do have bases in Canada. They have Canadian shops. So on the fair occasion, I do interact with a few Canadians, which got me thinking about how now they don't have freedom of speech in Canada. I was just, we didn't look into any of the political background regarding this or anything like that, or what the actual foreign policy would be. But what happens if over the phone, me in the United States speaking to somebody in Canada misgenders somebody in Canada? What if, some like big red Trigglypuff hybrid mutant calls in and I say, ma'am, and they're like, stop oppressing me! I'll sue you! Do I have to pay them money?
What's more concerning to me is because of our diplomatic relations with Canada, right? For instance, if you commit a crime in Canada and then retreat to the United States of America, we're
will be
obviously
brought
just
back
going
to
to bring you
Canada
back to
for the
Canada for a trial in their courts through their
We'll
governance.
probably hand you directly over to Canada as well.
In a similar basis, right, if you are in America and you start committing fraud by siphoning off money from Canadian accounts, you will still be taken over the Canadian border in order to make sure that you're going through Canadian
Exactly.
law.
So, yes, you
So-
can commit crimes against Canada from the United States, or rather from
And they
another
will
country
take you
within
there
another
as well.
country,
So my
and they'll take you
question
there.
is-
So, is it a crime for me to, if I am charged with that fine for misgendering somebody in Canada, do I then have to pay them money? And what happens if I refuse to pay them money? Well,
How does the diplomatic relations with that work?
does the
If-
United States hand me over to Canada for literally expressing my freedom of speech?
And that's the thing, is what I think will happen, right?
Because
Is I think that
basically-
if it can happen, what would happen is that you would be charged with a fine, you'd refuse to pay it, the Canadian government would issue a warrant for your arrest, they'd send it to America, and America would probably laugh at it. And it would be a diplomatic debacle. I don't think it would be very heated. I don't think it would turn into a war. But I think that it'd be like a funny, because
Yeah.
what would happen is
Well,
that
ultimately,
Canada would
it's-
be like, we need to arrest this person for violating the rights of transgender people. And they'd be like, okay, what did he do? And they're like,
Well, he said "ma'am" to her.
he
on
used the
phone
wrong
call,
pronouns
and then
during a
refused to correct
conversation.
himself.
And in that situation, the United States of America is like, well, I give my citizens the sovereign ability to
Speak freely.
speak
They are
freely.
allowed to call whoever, whichever they want, as long as it's
So
not
that is
hate
a
speech.
genuine conversation that I think is
And
important to talk
Ultimately,
about.
it's just very scary to me because here's the implication: what happens when you're friends, when you as a country are friends with people who don't have the same basic civil rights that you do?
Eventually, war. I don't think it would happen over something that small, but if Canada keeps going down the path it is, and I'm pretty positive it will, it's
especially
going to
with
go to a
Trudeau.
very bad place with the rest of the world. And I think that the concern for me greater is less that we're going to end up having this big fight over freedom of speech. I think I'm more concerned that that's going to infect our culture in the government more.
Yes,
Because up until, I mean,
we're
as much
already
as I
pretty
hate
much leaning
Trump,
there when it comes to the side of the
as
media.
much as I hate Trump, the last 4 years of Obama's platform was pretty much, how much freedom of speech censorship can I get away with? How much can I appeal to the progressive agenda by trying to put people in government who will support progressive policies? And that concerns me because, now we're seeing Trump, and I doubt that he'll do anything stupid like that because he's trying to get the public feel for the oligarchs that are all right-wing and support freedom of speech. What I'm concerned about is that I know that after Trump leaves, we're going to have a left-wing person in the presidency. It's going to happen.
Definitely.
What I'm concerned about is
just
that...
not even considering if Trump does anything bad with the next, 3 or 2 years he's got.
It's
I don't know.
3 years.
Something.
Roughly.
Whatever the case, ultimately, it doesn't matter how good or bad Trump is, we will have a
He will not be reelected, and we will not have a Republican run, because right now the majority...
Unless they cheat.
Unless they cheat, yeah.
Which
I sincerely
almost
doubt.
do.
But this is the concern, is that I'm concerned that we're going to go straight from Trump to someone like Bernie Sanders, and that would be really scary. Bernie Sanders seems really cool, but then you get in concept that he's kind of a liar about his own cause to start with. For instance, he keeps pushing this anti-war policy, yet he voted to bomb Syria with drones in 1999.
Actually, he was one of the few people who said that we shouldn't.
Yes, but he still voted to.
That's fucking retarded.
It is actually funny. It's actually because the first time that they voted, he voted to bomb them. The second time he voted not to.
Probably because he realized it was a mistake. Which
and I'm sure
ultimately
that's
I think
true.
that's a more admirable quality, but still.
It's just that his policies are very bad in terms of infrastructure. Anyways, so the thing with Trudeau, we're all concerned that he's going to take over the country, but he is also so incompetent that he invited an assassin to dinner.
So we don't know what to think about
we don't
Trudeau.
know what to think about Canada anymore.
I just
mean,
know
granted,
that we should
all
stop
just kinda...
allowing Justins from Canada to affect us.
Okay. All right. So let's see.
Imagine calling Justin Bieber Mr. Bieber.
I really
That's a very
really
weird
don't
thing
want
to
think
have to
about
think.
that. All right.
know.
So excuse me. I am so sorry. I tried to lean away from the mic. I hope you didn't hear that.
It was bad because you leaned to the left.
I know that was disgusting.
Ha ha.
Okay.
Ha
I get it now.
Yeah, you get it now?
No.
Yeah, see it.
All right, so our next topic, and this is the most controversial topic, so I apologize in advance, is we're going to talk about gun control.
Yes, we are.
Okay, so to start with, all of the students that BuzzFeed interviewed...
We should put a little bit of context first.
Okay.
BuzzFeed essentially interviewed a few students.
BuzzFeed interviewed a few students that were present at the school during the school shooting. Couple of caveats.
What's the
First
name of the
all,
school shooting then? What was the school? One moment, please. Which I think this kind of shows just what we're doing right now. We're actually looking up the name
knew
of the school.
name. I had it memorized, and
I think
now it's just...
ultimately this just goes to show how little we care about what the actual school is. It's more the fact that something happened.
Okay, Parkland School. Okay, so here's exactly what happened, right? Is BuzzFeed interviewed a bunch of these kids who had been present at school. There's two caveats that you have to keep in mind for this. They only showed 3 of the interviews.
Of how many?
No one knows. No one knows how many
Wow.
kids they actually interviewed or if they just interviewed those 3, but their sample size was 3. Second of all, none of those kids were actually present in the part of the school where the shooting took place. The shooting took place in the middle school. All of these students were high schoolers. 2 of the 3 of them were seniors. Okay. So
Wow.
that's a good start for caveats, right? And then it was revealed that all 3 of the students who had been interviewed
We're from the same drama club at the school.
and had been already being taught anti-gun policies before it came out, and had been heavily encouraged to do so. And the source on this is one of those 3 students' parents, who said outright that her child told her that they had all planned to do this the minute that they had realized the shooting was happening, that they had colluded together to do this very beautiful narrative of anti-gun. So here's the first thing. Assault weapons are mainly illegal, and yet, again, assault weapons are being used.
Yes.
It doesn't appear to be stopping it. The argument for which countries don't have gun laws versus have gun laws is pretty much an invalid argument, because the gun violence rate stays pretty much the same
Yeah.
Not necessarily the same actual like percentages, but the same in terms of what they were before and after those policies, percentages and what they typically are for that country, percentages and how many people are in that country. You know, for instance, Australia has a pretty small population for the amount of land mass that they have. So their violence rates were less than 2% before gun control was put in place. It was about 1.8, 1.7, I'm sure.
Yes. Something.
I'm pretty positive it was 1.8. I think it could have been 1.78 though.
I have no idea. I'm just nodding at you.
So the thing with that is that after the gun control policies were put in place, the actual statistical trend was the exact same as it had been predicted without the law. The violence rate decreased, definitely, but it decreased the same amount if they had taken away the guns in the first place. What changed, though, is that the amount of gun arrests went up, because anybody who was legally owning a gun suddenly didn't have the right to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you didn't take your gun to the government and give it to them in exchange for some money, if you had a gun that you had forgot about somewhere...
Of course, they could push the illusion that more gun-related crimes happened after they tried to ban the guns, because, of course, now owning a gun became a crime. So
if you had a gun that you had, like, put in a lockbox in a bank that was 20 miles away, and you never used it, you were committing a crime if you didn't go pick up that gun and give it to the government. And so there was a lot of controversy over that. There was a lot of controversy over other countries. For instance, the Netherlands. The Netherlands doesn't have guns. In fact, up until the end of 2015, the beginning of 2016, they hadn't had an incident of police or civil gun violence for 30 years.
Wow.
They had not had a police shooting happen.
I don't know it was that long.
It was a very long time. What happened was, on Pusher Street, which is a part of Freetown, Christiania, a pure collective democracy, a sort of hippie-based market commune, essentially.
Yeah. It's what everybody cites as communism can work, even though it's not really communism.
It's not really communism. Basically, it's a sociological experiment that just has a bunch of people move to a place that doesn't have any laws except for the laws they can all agree upon collectively. Yeah. Part of that is that they only have it changes depending upon how many years have gone by, but they typically have around 8 to 13 laws, and none of those laws are against hard drugs. So for the longest amount of time, hard drugs really took over Pusher Street, and then in the late 90s, they started phasing out hard drugs collectively, and they started just doing soft drugs like marijuana, and then from marijuana, there was just this influx of travelers, obviously.
Well, yeah.
And so there was this big problem with the police and with the people who lived there, because the police, it was still technically illegal for them to sell it. Now, it wasn't necessarily illegal for them to sell it within their land. The problem was that because of the influx and outflux of the drug leaving the rest of Christiania, it was technically illegal for them to sell it to anyone who didn't live and stay in Christiania. So what happened was a drug dealer...
Another case of violating the rights of another country.
Yeah. So basically what happened is a drug dealer from the Netherlands who was not from Christiania came to Christiania selling hard drugs. The people of Christiania told him he couldn't sell it on Pusher Street, so he started selling it in back alleys. He robbed a guy at gunpoint, and then a police officer tried to stop him, and he killed him. He shot him to death, and they ended up catching him, and he went to prison, obviously. And everyone mourned. The entire country genuinely cried over what was happening, because it was the first time in decades that someone had been shot with gun violence. Here's the thing, though. The police officer died because he didn't have a gun. He doesn't have the ability to defend himself. Nobody does. So the reason why they're all safe is because their population is so small.
Yeah.
And they're so non-threatening to any other country that it's essentially why no one attacks Switzerland. Is because there's barely anybody in Switzerland, and Switzerland has never been a military power of threat. So why would you attack Switzerland?
Switzerland's always been a very powerful military that nobody has ever bothered to get involved with.
And that's exactly the thing, is that with the Netherlands, the reason why they have no violence is because of their cultural belief. Because a lot of their cultural belief... And when you get
a country, or country, sovereign nation, whatever, as small as Christiania, said Christiania. Ultimately, it's a lot easier to stratify politic.
And that's exactly the point, is when you have a smaller government, like, whenever someone says to me, oh, well, we published this law in the EU and the UK in this specific European country and it worked really well. Well, that's because your population is like 1/100th of ours. The United States population and its federal government is larger than most other countries by and large.
Consider this. Most of the countries in Europe are about the size of a state in the United States, of which, as I'm sure most people know, there are 50.
And that's the thing, is that we don't allow the state rights to have much power anymore, and yet that's literally what the European Union is having issues with, is that the entire countries in the European Union are essentially what we would consider states, and those states are not being given rights, and because of that, it's slowly destroying their country from the inside out.
Which is why Brexit is genius.
That's why Brexit is genius. Unfortunately, the British are fucking insane.
Yes.
So
Very insane.
the thing with
But at least they've localized their problems.
the thing with gun politics is that we're not saying just make guns legal, because that's not going to solve the issue overnight.
No.
What you need to do is
it is perfectly acceptable for you to regulate who's allowed to have a gun. Just the extent at which people advocate for that will not solve the issue.
It's fine to say, well, this person has killed people, so they shouldn't be allowed to own a gun. This person has an illness that makes them prone to violent outbursts, so this person shouldn't have a gun. It's fine to say that, right? The concern is that what we're doing right now is we are increasing the size of the government exponentially. We're giving them more power over our day-to-day lives. And we are taking away our ability to defend ourselves by trying to get away with these gun control laws. And what that's going to do is it's going to end up in a situation where, like Canada, where the government is going to tell you, you have to say this, or you can't say this, or you can't do this, and you can't do that. And you're not going to be able to do anything about it. You can try to protest, but
here's what happens.
Stand in front of a tank, the tank is going to win.
Exactly. For example, if I misgender somebody in Canada and they say, well, you have to pay a fine. If you argue that you still have free speech in this case, first of all, no.
Because if you don't pay the fine, you go to prison.
What happens if you don't pay the fine? Well, they try to arrest you. Well, what happens if you don't want to be arrested? Well, they kill you.
So that's the thing, is that if you say, is that it becomes a point where, especially in America, where we beef up the military every year, we spend so much on the military.
So much on the military. Quick statistic, if I may, this is my favorite one. Of the top 10 military spenders in the United Nations, do keep in mind that, yes, North Korea is part of the United Nations. U.S. is number 1 out of the top 10, and we spend more money on military than the other 9 in the top 10 combined.
That's concerning, and that's why I say that to other libertarians who may or may not watch this and want to have a dialogue with me. Why would you not want to just immediately give gun control? Well, because that's not going to solve the problem overnight. Yes, I believe that we should do away with some gun control, and yes, I believe that we should make the government smaller in that way, but I also think that we need to make the government smaller in military. Because if we just make gun control cease, what we're going to see is we're going to see a lot of different deals between companies and government to get rid of some of the government processes and to have governments start making more money from this mass arms race. So my concern is that you don't have the ability to protect yourself. It is becoming increasingly harder to do so. To the fact that they make specific types of knives illegal. To the fact that they're trying to make knives illegal.
Along with
to the fact
that if you use a gun to defend yourself, you are using an incorrect amount of force, and you will be tried for murder.
That's exactly
your
the thing.
Own life and
is that
if
a bunch of home invaders break into your house with, say, one of them has a crossbow and the rest of them have knives and baseball bats, and you defend yourself with a shotgun, you will most likely be going to prison for murder. Because you are using an excessive amount of force, and that's the genuine argument that I've seen. Like, I've literally seen people go to prison because someone pulled a knife out on him in the middle of the street, and they shot him. And they didn't kill him, but they just shot him, and because of that, he was no longer allowed to use his. Anyways. Sorry, we just got a news update. We're gonna ignore it for now. Maybe next episode.
Maybe next time, kids.
But if you shoot yourself in the leg or something, or if you shoot this guy in the leg and he can never walk again, you would be charged for the amount of damage that you did to him, even though the reason you did the damage is to prevent you from dying. Yeah. So this is the concern I have. Now, when you're talking about these school shootings, when you're talking about these people keep coming in with guns and they keep killing people, well, first of all, gun control obviously isn't working. I actually saw a tweet earlier today that made me laugh, and this guy said, if they don't make assault weapons illegal, I'm going to buy a rocket launcher. And the guy said...
A rocket launcher is not an assault weapon.
Well, the guy said, rocket launchers are illegal to own in the United States. And he said, yeah, not on the black market. And he said, so what you're saying is gun control doesn't work? The thing about guns, right, is it works the same way drugs do. We're not saying guns are great. We're not saying drugs are great. What we're saying is that when you make them illegal, the only place they can go typically has to... Because when you're talking about criminal enterprises, right, if you're talking two businesses competing in broad daylight to sell guns, they're trying to produce better guns at lower costs. They're trying to offer a wider variety of the amount of guns that they have, and they're trying to make sure that they can get warranties for your guns that are good, so that you have good repaired guns, so that you're able to defend yourself, so that you're able to hunt, so that you're able to do this. When you're talking about criminal enterprises, you have two different groups with guns who are already felons.
Yes.
If they're caught. So why would I spend time trying to make myself look better in the competitive scene by being cleaner, more respectable, better quality, when I can just kill the guy who's competing with me? And that's exactly what happens. Exactly. That's mob politics. That's crime politics. That's why gangs get mad when drugs are made legal.
Exactly.
Is because it destroys their
business.
Thing, is
that's what everybody's, and I'm going to talk about the war on drugs real quick here. Everybody's like, war on drugs, war on drugs. You want to know how you end the war on drugs? You make drugs legal to an extent. Because that means that the more drugs that you make that are legal, the less drugs gangs can sell, the less drugs gangs can sell, the less money they have, the less control they have.
Let me put it this way, right? When you buy drugs,
if you make drugs legal,
let me go back into some darker history, right? If you buy drugs from a drug dealer, you don't know exactly what's going into those drugs. Now, you might be able to test it. You might be able to take a kit and break apart some of it and test it, but you don't always know, right? Yeah. And you might not have the right chemicals to test it with. You might not have the right kit. You might not know the right information. You might be testing it for something and that you shouldn't necessarily have to test it for, and you might have missed something you're supposed to test.
Or maybe just the sheer amounts of tests that you did destroy the product to begin with.
Right. So those are the concerns, right? Is that in order for you to actually know if it's safe, you have to test it. If someone is selling drugs in broad daylight legally, and they're still in business...
You don't have to test it, because if they harm you, you can go to the law for help. If drugs are illegal, they're not going to care if they sell you bad product, because they'll be arrested for selling it to you in the first place.
Even if the government didn't exist, if someone sold you drugs and it was really bad and it made you sick, right? You wouldn't shop there anymore, and you'd tell people what happened to you, and you'd go to the hospital, and they'd prove that it was that, and those people would go out of business. Let's apply this to guns for a second, right? If you buy a gun on the black market, how do you know that that gun isn't defective? How do you know that that gun isn't... How do you know that the polymer that they lined it with isn't lead? How do you know that the materials that they use to rebuild the rigging system isn't actually shit and will explode in your hand? Guns have done that on the black market. Yeah. How do you know that you buy, an armor-piercing round, and instead of it actually being armor-piercing, it's Teflon coat? How do you know that? These are dangerous weapons. We're aware of that, despite being in support of getting away with gun control. The concern that we have...
to an extent.
The concern that we have is that this gun that I've bought, if I bought it legally, I know that the company...
I can be assured that the company is selling
I know that the company has to be selling a good product. I know that the gun isn't going to kill me, and I know where I can get more guns if I need to protect myself better.
Or if the gun does harm me. I know where I can go.
I know where I can go. You can't say that about the underground. You can't say that about people. If someone sells you if someone sells you weed and it turns out to be oregano, which I've actually witnessed happened, if someone sells you weed and it turns out to be oregano, you can't go to the cops for that. You might have just lost $200, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You're not getting that back. And that's exactly the point, is that when you talk about drugs, you're talking the same argument with guns. The only difference is that guns can be used to willfully kill someone. Drugs, you have to work a lot harder to get them to willfully kill someone.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
you
that
either have to
and-
trick them into ingesting it, or you have to inflict it upon them, which is a lot harder than just pulling a trigger.
Yes.
Now, here's the concern with guns, is everyone's concerned that in terms of school shootings, well, we can't give guns to kids. Well, I agree, you probably
Well,
shouldn't
yes,
give an
you probably
8-year-old a
shouldn't give
pistol.
Guns to kids.
But the concern is that if we give teachers guns, right, they're gonna hurt the kids. Okay,
Excuse
why
me,
would you? Why
what?
would you? If you're employing teachers that you think could possibly do that,
You
if
have
you're
a different issue.
if this is
as
the
a
exact
school.
concern, is that if your concern is that teachers are going to abuse that power because of nature, well, that's wrong. People don't abuse nature by the sole purpose of it, because in order for us to exist as humans, we have to coexist, we have to work together. So if you just seek power for the
Humans
purpose
are
of power,
incredibly social creatures from every single aspect
and
of our
because we're
lives.
social creatures, we can't just seek power for the sake of power, because when you do that, you come off as an asshole, you come off as violent, and people refuse to interact with you, and you lose all of the agency you have.
Exactly.
Now, when you're talking about teachers, if you believe that a teacher is going to use a gun to threaten or harm children,
You have a different issue than the gun.
the gun is not the issue, it's the temperament of your teacher. And I wouldn't put it past some of the teachers,
Yeah.
especially in Chicago, but I wouldn't say that that's because of their nature, and I
But
wouldn't
if
say
you,
it's
if
because
you
there's-
honestly suspect that if you were to give your teacher a weapon, they would use it to harm their students, fire that fucking teacher.
like, okay, for instance, Texas, right? Texas allows their teachers to have a concealed gun on them during school. In fact, they're encouraged to in order to prevent school shootings. When's the last time you heard about teachers shooting students?
I haven't heard about teachers.
I did
students.
research before this while I was outside having a cigarette. I spent a couple of minutes, 10, 20 minutes looking through a big list of all these articles trying to find a single one where a teacher had shot a student. I could not find a single one where a teacher carrying a gun in Texas had shot a student. What I did find is I found lots of articles about inner city kids and in urban areas of students carrying guns illegally and shooting their teachers out of rage, but I've never seen the opposite happen.
Yeah.
That's not to say it can't happen. What I'm saying is that the likelihood of
sure,
it
but-
happening seems to be very low. That I would trust a teacher more with a gun than pretty much anyone else at a school system.
Well, yeah.
I probably wouldn't give my gym teacher a gun, but that's just because I don't run very fast.
God damn it.
He's got to find a way to inspire us, I'm sure. So, that's the thing with guns, is that when you actually look at the history, I want to bring up one point that really irritates me. It's tangentially related. It's still about guns. People always say to me, if the founding fathers had known that guns would have been able to fire 30 rounds
This
in 10
point.
seconds, they wouldn't have not have supported having the right to bear arms. People could own cannons. People could own cannons. People could load a single ball into a machine and shoot it at their window at their neighbor's house and instantly destroy
The
completely.
entire house.
And they didn't. Or at least when they did do it, it wasn't widespread enough for people to think, hey, maybe we should make cannons illegal. This is exactly the thing, is that the Founding Fathers, you were allowed to own warships, you were allowed to own cannons, you were allowed to make Molotovs, you were allowed to own guns. It didn't matter what weapon it was. You needed a weapon because you needed to be able to oppose the government if they were acting against your rights. You needed to be able to protect yourself from other people who were trying to revoke your rights. That was your God-given right in America. And
Because if it was fucking swords, it would be the same situation. And it's like and nobody would be like,
if they had known about hand and a half swords,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have been allowed to have short swords.
It's like
Well, we
That's
had
not-
pole arms, so
Exactly. That is the exact
that's
translation
literally
of
the
how this
comparison.
works.
Is that
It's like, imagine you're in,
they
feudal
start
Japan
with
or
the
some shit.
supposition that you had a really shitty version of what we have right now, and ergo, if they had known how powerful it
That
was
if
going to
they had
become,
known that this version could become better, they wouldn't have allowed the original version to exist to begin with.
but that's not
That's
true
not
because
how
at the time there were
innovation
things
works.
of comparable, if not worse, strength. Because I'd
exactly.
much rather have someone shoot at my house with an AK-47 than I would them shoot at my house with a cannon.
Yeah, still to this
In
day.
truth, I would rather someone point an AK-47 at our house and shoot from the bottom up towards me, and because I could hit the ground, I could hide against a wall. Someone shoots a cannon at your house.
Well, first of all,
It's knocking the
you'll probably
foundation away.
die.
There's shrapnel. There's splinters. This is exactly my concern, is that America was built upon things that people don't want to talk about. John Hancock, the biggest writer of the first of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. He's the one who wrote the big signature. It's why
That's
it's
why we
called your
say, can we
Hancock,
have your
right?
Hancock?
He was a smuggler. That was his trade in America. Is that is that the British government wouldn't let you sell specific things, and he refused.
John
he
Han
said,
Solo.
he said, no, I'm going to sell whatever I want. And that's exactly the point, is that we've now reached the point where people don't even realize, like, you're not allowed to sell whatever you want. I mean, your child can't sell lemonade.
Yes,
You can't
your
have a
child
tree
literally
on your
cannot
property
sell
that looks ugly. And yet, when someone
Even if
comes...
that tree is part of the value of the property.
If someone comes to
Even
your
if you
house
think it
and
looks
says,
great.
I'm sorry, you can't do that anymore, and you say, well, I'm not hurting anybody, so I'm going to keep doing it, they're going to say, well, we're going to fine you then, and if you don't pay the
that
fine,
we'll arrest you
we'll
and
arrest
seize
you.
your property.
If you say no to that,
They will kill you.
they will kill you. They will attempt to kill you, and you have nothing to defend yourself with because we are so concerned about defending one another. That's how we do it. If you want to protect children, if you want to protect the elderly, if you want to protect the mentally ill and the infirm, then you need to be able to take care of yourself. And part of that is that you can't just trust in the government having a monopoly of force. The reason why libertarians who are minarchists still support the concept of the government having force is because it's fine for the government to have a military or a police force if the people are also armed to the equivalent. That's why that checks and balances works. That's why the executive branch of the American government wasn't so bad back then, is because if we sent the American troops to a plantation to try to seize the property, most likely the workers on that plantation had the same types of equipment.
Yeah.
Disparity in property right now is really bad, and the major
see,
reason is because
here's the thing
of
as well.
regulation.
Here's the thing as well, is that every single time we bring up the school shootings, we're always like, this is why we need to get rid of at least automatic weapons. Let me ask you a question. If nobody else inside the building has a gun besides the school shooter, why does it matter if the gun is automatic or not?
It's already an illegal weapon. This is the thing, is that when the Texas shooting happened with all the people at the country concert who were shot down by the gunman from the hotel, that man was a legal gun owner. He owned legal automatic firearms, and yet he bought AK-47s and modified them illegally because it was because they were more efficient at killing people when they were modified. That's exactly the thing, is that he made them shoot faster. He made them able to carry more bullets. He made changes to them that were illegal, that are not in standard practice in the creation of a gun right now. And then there are some things that are not illegal to own that you would be appalled if you knew about. For instance, Dragon's Breath rounds. Dragon's Breath rounds are not illegal, and they contain napalm.
Yes.
It's legal to carry a shotgun shell that can
That
fire
shoots fucking napalm.
a 20-foot cone of fire that is pure napalm in any direction. And that's... I don't care. It's not a concern to me, because I know that despite the fact that that's being sold, people haven't killed anyone with it.
Yeah.
We haven't seen everywhere that, oh my god, because we can sell... I mean, if the ability to make and use weapons meant that people were going to use weapons for violence, imagine how much fire would be in America. Because all a Molotov is a rag and a bottle of alcohol.
Exactly.
Literally anybody over the age of 21, which means that 65 years of human experience in America, you have the possibility to, at any moment, just take a bottle, dip a rag in a little bit of it, light it and just throw it, and you have created a weapon of immense proportion. And yet people don't do that commonly. It's not a normal thing to happen.
Yeah.
Violence does not just happen erratically. Violence happens erratically when people are made extreme about something.
Exactly.
Like the
And,
terrible
like another
sieges,
thing
pillages, and rapes that happen under specific institutions, most of the time it's because the government or a religious organization said that what they were doing was good or that they deserved what they were getting. Like the Japanese people raping the settlers on the islands during World War I and II. They did that because they believed that they were stronger, because they had this social Darwinist idea inside them, and then they were taught that because they had won, they were more powerful and they could do whatever they want.
Exactly, and you can make an extremist out of anybody. A good example, I think, he was a Nazi scientist or something like that. He had trained his son psychologically that if you ever find that you disagree with somebody, it is morally all right for you to literally just kill them. So what happened? Well, one day this son got older, found that he disagreed with his father, and killed him without remorse. He felt he wasn't a sociopath, but he felt completely fine about having killed his own father for disagreeing with him, because that's what he was taught. Because when you give a lot of power to an authority, when you create somebody in authority, something that you can look up to, you will believe them, because that's the way human psychology works.
That's how they've done research after research. The reason why the Nazis were so easily able to commit atrocious crimes is because of the delegation of authority, because it was a mandate down from a higher power. They were able to distill all of their
plus
guilt.
It was a justification. They had grown up in a post-World War I Germany, which is one of the worst countries that you could possibly imagine in the First World. It was terrible to live there, and they found somebody to blame. Hitler gave them somebody to blame. Their entire party gave them somebody to blame. And then when the government tried to say, no, that's incorrect, and jailed those people who were saying this is what Germany's problems are, they created a cult.
They
to
created
follow.
sympathy for the Nazis by not offering an alternative proposition. Because of how they were running the government, because of all the systems they had in place, because of their absolute fear of the sovereignty of the the League of Nations back then?
I think so. Something.
The League of Nations, because they were so afraid of the Allies, the government refused to take action to try to make the country better, and so so they never proposed an alternative solution to the problems going on in Germany. So the only person offering a substantial answer was also the only person who is currently being vindicated and destroyed by the government. You create sympathy. I'm not saying I sympathize. I'm not saying that the Nazis are right. In fact, we both hate Nazis to an almost extreme manner. It's a romantic thing.
Yeah.
But the thing with
Not
guns
romantic
is that
in the context of
the ability to do
love.
violence does not determine whether or not someone does violence, because
Exactly.
everybody has the capability to kill someone.
No,
With your
there
bare
are
hands.
literally more deaths, I think, from just sheer beatings per year than there are actual murders by guns.
And that's exactly the point, is that
So
weapons and
here's the
making
thing,
it
here's the
easier to
thing.
kill someone doesn't necessarily increase the likelihood that they're going to kill someone. What makes it easier to kill someone is dehumanizing the person that you have the ability to kill.
Exactly.
And the
Which is
reasoning
why
why
the majority of murders occur between people who are mentally ill, because they do not have to have the capacity.
Because once it gets to a specific point, typically the types of mentally ill people who do commit these violent crimes have been sick for so long and haven't done anything that they are actually suffering a form of psychosis. So they don't even realize what they're doing anymore.
Also, a quick side note, something that we discovered, when people talk about gun violence, they do very much try to push up the numbers there. You always hear gun deaths this year.
Yeah.
Little did you know
70% of those gun violence crimes are actually suicides, which is really sad.
Yeah.
Which is really sad,
majority,
especially when you consider
like,
that 90% of suicides are men. That's really, really sad.
And was it like 90% of suicides are men, and like a much smaller number of them actually kill themselves by guns?
So that being 70% of gun violence is suicide, and then 90% of men are
suicide victims are men.
Are men. That's that's one of the saddest things you've ever heard, and we don't talk about it because of the whole feminism thing, but that's not the point we're making. The point we're making is that they inflate the amount of gun violence statistics by correlating or trying to equate suicide with murder.
Yes.
And it's not the same thing. Suicide is
it's a separate thing in its entirety, ultimately.
Suicide is the destruction of your own property. Murder is the destruction of someone else's. And I might disagree with suicide, but that is
ultimately
your
what
choice.
It comes down to.
It's ultimately it's not the same thing as murder, period. It's a completely different thing. The only difference is that someone died by a gun. But leftists include the
suicide victims as
suicide
part of
because the
gun
amount of
deaths
actual gun violence
is not sufficient for their agenda.
It's really not. I mean, it's super sad. So what do we got? We got more people need to have access to guns. The military needs to be extremely defunded, and all of the processes by which they, all of the equipment that they have that they've already built needs to slowly be divided amongst the people through the process of the market.
Exactly, which, there comes your tax dollars in. You can just sell untaxed things directly from the government to the people. There you go.
And then, what Eain's saying there is that the government can sell you a gun and you pay, the $200 for the handgun, but then you also pay the $20 tax on top of that, and then the government has made $220 of profit directly.
Yes,
exactly.
Directly. Well, see, that's the thing is that it's just a failsafe ultimately. Like that's like the safe defense. It's like, oh well, as a nation we can't afford to just get rid of all these guns. We have to, pay money to have them disassembled and melted down and whatnot like that. Well, here's an idea. Just stop taking my taxes to make guns and just sell us the guns that you already have. That way you are losing significantly less taxes.
Right. So on top of that, okay, so we said that the ability to cause violence doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to be violent. That's true throughout all of history. Most violence is caused by institution, whether that be government, religion, or ideology.
As well as discrimination. Discrimination rarely happens on a person-to-person basis.
Disgust is the biggest thing.
Exactly.
So, I suppose the last topic... we need a better segue because it's a little more humorous.
Yeah, it's quite humorous. I think we should have had like a bell curve to the humor. We start out lighthearted, get heavy-hearted in the middle, and then not be depressed by the end. But ultimately, this is just the last thing that
we're literally
here.
just gonna pull up the article because it's the funniest thing I've read in a while.
We probably won't even discuss it. We're probably just gonna read the fucking article because
oh my god.
Here's the headline. Who knew the race to colonize Mars is patriarchal, akin to Columbus's rape of America, by thecollegefix.com. What?
Sorry, no, this is, we gotta go to NBC directly for this one. It's not by College Fix, it's by NBC.
Oh, I think that was it down there, maybe. Keep going down a little more.
Did they pull it? Did they pull it in the hour and a half that we've been on air? Because that would have been the funniest thing. Oh, no, they didn't. Okay.
Okay, thank God.
The presumed right to use and abuse something and then walk away to conquer something new is a hallmark of colonialism.
All right, should we take this in paragraphs or?
I
Let's
think
just
that
read
what
it.
we'll do is we'll just chop it up as we go. We'll take turns. First of all, this presumption already irritates me because that's not what colonialism was. That's not what we did.
Yes,
we didn't just conquer your
idea.
territories and then leave you alone. We wanted your tax money, so we tried to gentrify you. You might disagree with that. I just definitely disagree with the whole violent conquering part, but
Also,
that doesn't...
the presumed right to use and abuse has literally nothing to do with colonialism. Colonialism is about expanding your space of resources, essentially. If I can get bananas from, this area, and I can also get bread from this country, and I can make banana bread or whatever, if I'm going to different areas with the intent to colonize them so that I can increase the market of my original country, which has not been used and abused, I still own it and I still use it. That's not equivalent to what they're saying. But
what does a midlife crisis look like in the 21st century?
Frittering away your life savings on red sports cars so last century. Instead, today's man is grappling with the limitations of his mortality and spends $90 million on a rocket to launch a $100,000 electric car helmed by a robot by the name of Starman into space.
So first things first, they're going to talk smack about Elon Musk. That's great, because Elon Musk's
A bit of a fucking idiot. When it comes to certain things,
he's not a scientist. He's a scientist. He believes in the cult of scientism. He believes scientism is going to solve everything in his life. That science is just the be-all, end-all to every problem in the universe, and that it cannot possibly do wrong. But they're making fun of the fact that he's having trouble grappling with mortality. That he's having an issue with the fact that he does have to die, and that he's getting close to death. As if that's
also they seem to suggest that we want a new space race. SpaceX founder Elon Musk said. What is wrong with that?
So
what is wrong with creating a competition into a new territory that hasn't been explored before? Because let me ask you something.
Musk isn't the only billionaire looking to enter the space race. Amazon's Jeff Bezos and his private aerospace company, Blue Origin, while Virgin's Richard Branson, a prominent adventurer, created Virgin Galactic back in 2004. So what they're pointing out here is that Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Richard Branson are all company owners that own very, very successful companies that are very wealthy, and they have all invested in space. So we haven't gotten to their criticism of it yet, but let's talk about why this is actually cool. Because NASA was terrible at what they did.
Period. The majority of breakthroughs that NASA made were because we were fighting the Russians on it.
And even then, the majority of actual engineering designs that were created were not by scientists who were currently employed at NASA, but instead by scientists and students who were not employed at all. Mm-hmm. These are people who had nothing to do with NASA and simply created something that NASA couldn't pass up. My point is that pretty much everything that NASA succeeded in really well, and don't get me wrong, love space, love science, but in order for them to succeed, they had to heavily subsidize it to try to make it look like a business, because it isn't, and it's not very profitable.
It just receives, shit from the government. But let me get this paragraph here. These men, particularly Musk, are not only heavily interested in who can get their rockets into space first, but in colonizing Mars. The desire to colonize, to have unquestioned, unchallenged, and automatic access to something, to any type of body, and to use it at will, is a patriarchal one. Indeed, there is no ethical consideration among these billionaires about whether this should be done. Rather, the conversation is when it will be done, because in the eyes of these intrepid explorers, this is the only way to save humanity.
All right, so there's three things I want to say about this. So my first point about the whole, look at these companies, aren't they great? I never really said why they're great, and here's the reason why they're great. Because they fund space travel, and they do so with actual scientists and engineers, but they also incentivize them to work as hard as possible to make these things come true, so they get it done faster and cheaper than NASA ever did.
Exactly.
Solely by just saying, I will give you $100,000 if you can get this rocket done before the NASA deadline. That's how half of these competitions...
That can be dangerous, but...
It can be dangerous.
With refinement.
And so here's the second thing. I believe there's a tiny grain of validity in this argument. This one sentence here, right? There is no ethical consideration whether this should be done, all right? This is a big problem I have with modern science, is that we never consider whether or not something should be done. We just consider when it will be done. And that's the issue. That's the problem that I have with Elon Musk, is that
actually, because why should there be an ethical consideration? In the case of ethics, it's about whether or not you should violate the rights of another person for benefits.
And that's exactly the thing.
Who's being violated if we colonize Mars, which is a terrible idea.
It is a terrible idea, and that's exactly my point. Is that I think that was the third thing I was going to say, is that there's no ethics to consider in this.
Yeah.
What
It's
they're
like the
doing
only
is
grain
they're
of
pouring a
truth
bunch
is
of
that-
money into this, and that is a huge waste of money and resources. And yes, people, like, for instance, with Hyperloop, they're not going to space. They're going to try to do this vacuum-sealed train. It's a terrible
we should do
idea.
an entire episode.
We
on the
will do an
Hyperloop
entire
because-
episode on the Hyperloop because it's absolutely stupid. But long story short, it's a terrible idea, and the way that they started the funding for it is through crowdfunding on Kickstarter. Basically, they took everyone's money, and then they're also going to use tax dollars from NASA in order to support this thing. So that obviously pisses me off for the tax dollars part. But for the part of Kickstarter, I don't care.
Yeah,
if
because
you're
that's
dumb enough
just
to support
consumers
it,
being
this is
stupid.
and that's the thing, is that people said that from the moment it came out, they explained why it wouldn't work. Thunderfoot has great work on why the Hyperloop is a terrible,
Thunderfoot is actually a
terrible
great
idea.
scientist, really.
Great scientist, terrible politicalist, but that's
Yes.
besides the point.
Yeah.
So,
You should stick to science, which I'm glad he's done.
ethical consideration, there's no ethics. If it
There is
doesn't,
no ethics. If
you are not
nobody is
using
being
force,
harmed,
if you are not using force or coercion against someone, you are not doing anything unethical, period.
yes.
You can do something really mean.
Hey, here's the thing: is that it's to have unquestioned, unchallenged, and automatic access to something, to any type of body, and use it at will, is not a patriarchal idea. To have
It's an
unfiltered
authoritarian
access
idea. It's
to
not.
something-
It's not necessarily patriarchal. I mean,
Well,
look,
that's not even. Is that? It's not even an authoritarian idea. Basically, how would you like to have unquestioned and unchallenged access to free energy or water for everybody? That's what? Oh, that's patriarchy. You shouldn't want to secure the benefit of yourself and your family.
that is a good point.
And here's the thing.
See,
is that,
I was thinking
guess
about
what
the
government-
implication of this right here to any type of body.
Oh,
I
any
thought
type
this
of
was
body.
implying
See,
something
it's
sexual,
translatory to women's
and I
bodies.
assumed that would be more
Here's a
authoritarian.
question: what happens if a woman wants
Oh, it is
unchallenged
literally-
access to a man's?
Oh, this is literally what they're going to imply. All right.
It is the
It
same
is a-
instinctual and cultural force that teaches men that everything and everyone in their line of vision is theirs for the taking. You know, just like walking up to a woman and grabbing her by the pussy.
It's there, so just grab it because you can. This is not true. This is not how men
Holy
think. This is not
shit.
how any human thinks. The only type
This
of
is
people
not
who
based in reality.
you know who thinks this way? Oligarchs. That's what Trump is. He's not even a man at this point.
Well,
He's
see,
not
here's the
even
thing.
human. He's an oligarch. He uses
thing
the
is that
government to
people-
subsidize his failing business in order to ensure that he will continue to make money. He stocks government planes up with his brand of alcohol. He is
Yeah.
intertwining his name with the government. That's not patriarchy. That's not about race. That's not about anything in his identity because he's an oligarch.
Here's the thing: is that it's not patriarchal if someone who isn't a man could get away with it. And let me get you in a little secret: Trump's not the only person who should be capable of doing this. Like it's not a male thing to have unfiltered access to something, and it's not a
Statistically-
male thing to want unfiltered access to something.
A controversial statement, I know, but statistically, when you look at different sexuality and genders and biological sexes in comparison to their actual abuse rates,
Something really funny.
the men are the least likely, man-on-man gay relationships are the least likely to have an abusive relationship.
And
Straight men versus straight women, straight men are more likely to abuse a woman than a
Yes.
woman is to abuse a man. However, in lesbian relationships, women are more likely to abuse each other.
I think almost 40%
Yes.
of lesbian relationships have reported abuse of some kind.
And this isn't to say that this is an inherent nature of lesbianism. What it has to do is it has to do with physiology. Is that two men are less likely to hit each other because they know that both of each other can do damage. A man is less likely to is more likely to hit a woman because of testosterone, but he's also less likely to do so because he's aware that he can hurt her.
Yes.
A woman is less likely to hit a man because she realizes
That if she were to piss him off, she probably wouldn't be able to stop him from hurting her back.
so
Which is
that's
it's
why
a
those are
purely
in the middle.
physiological thing. Like,
And then
you
women
wouldn't
are
try
more
to punch
likely
a
to hit
fucking
each
bear
other
in the
is
face.
because they are typically physiologically similar in size and weight, in bone structure. So if you hit another woman, you know that they're going to feel it just as much as you're going to feel it in your hand. You can't say that when you hit a man. Now, women sometimes take into context the fact that they know that if they hit a man, they're not going to be taken as seriously as if he hit her.
Exactly.
So
Which
that's
is
why they're at
how
the
the
moderate
majority
amount.
of
That's why in straight
male and female,
relationships,
relationships, the females are able to get away with more abuse because
Despite the fact that
there
they commit a
is
little bit
that-
less than men,
Yeah.
they get away with it more often solely because of the fact of our social and
because
cultural
of that
perspective.
thing, because of the physiological argument as well, where we're like, well, women are less likely to hit men for sure because if like a man could just fucking obliterate her in one punch. Well, it's like, see, that's the thing, is that the women who abuse know that.
Yeah, it's about amnesty. Anyway, so this is a concern
Also,
to me.
let me little quick thing. The grab her by the pussy line is not about I'm a man and I can do whatever I want. It's about being rich. He was shooting this shit with his rich friends, and basically what he says was, it's never taken in its full context. What he says is that people respect or want to respect rich people on a different level than anybody else because they recognize it as power. And Donald Trump says he's like, at a certain point you get so rich that you could do anything you want, and no matter how bad. You could grab a woman right by the pussy and she wouldn't stop you because
No,
you're
he
rich.
says specifically she would let you. This is my point. Is I think he's an idiot. All right, I don't like him.
No, you
But
don't
everything-
have to, you don't think that you don't have to think that he's an intelligent to say what's actually being said. Like, and I don't think he's intelligent either.
So let's continue on this. I want to be clear. I think we should be a multi-planet species, not a single planet species on another planet. Musk said. What kind of future do we want to have? Do you want to have a future where we are confined to one planet, or where we are on many planets? Okay. So just a quick moment for if you guys are still watching. You guys totally have the choice. You can 100%. You have the ability to say what you believe. Now here's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm not saying we're gonna leave Earth and abandon it because we've destroyed it and we need to go to Mars. I'm saying that we need to
why
take
should we
care of
not
the
also
Earth, but
go
why
to
not
Mars?
also live on Mars? Do you want to live on one planet or as many planets as possible? Do you want more choices? So what do you guys think? Do you think that he's wrong? Do you think that that's entitled to say that we should take care of the Earth, but we should also be able to go to other planets and expand off
Because we
further?
can.
Is that inherently entitled, or is that more honest? You can leave your opinion in the chat or in the comments after we've published this video afterwards. So you can read this one.
So this Columbusing attitude. I
What
don't
a
think Columbusing is
terrible
a
word.
How about a colonist attitude?
That would be better, but they want to
Imperialist
specifically.
attitude.
They want to
They
draw,
want to draw
the
comparison
parodies
to
of
Columbus
Elon
because
Musk and Columbus.
Now we know that Columbus was a fucking terrible person. Anyway, this Columbusing attitude, a strident business acumen laced with an imperialist ethos, comes with an air of benevolence. Musk doesn't just want to colonize Mars to satisfy his ego. No, he wants to colonize Mars to help his fellow humans. So they're literally demonizing him for even saying that perhaps it is charitable.
He's basically they're trying to portray this as being false. I think even okay, right here, right?
Let's not skip this quote here. Elon Musk says, "I really think there are two fundamental paths, brackets for humans. One path is we stay put on Earth forever, and some eventual extinction event wipes us out," he said. In this way, colonizing Mars is a collective life insurance policy, quote unquote. Go ahead.
And then they say, and this is where their criticism kicks in this way, colonizing Mars is a collective life insurance policy. Although considering the last 500 years of colonization on this planet alone, one could wonder whose lives, according to Musk and other rich white men like himself, are worth being insured. So what they're trying to imply is that Elon Musk really genuinely cares, in that sarcastic fashion. They're saying, oh man, he really cares, except for it'll be impossible because it'll cost too much for everyone else, because that's what colonization does. First of all, no, it doesn't.
No.
Colonization
See, that's the thing, is that
makes everything cheaper for everyone because it expands the amount of land, it expands
it
the amount of
expands
research, it
because
expands the
you
amount of
can
intellect.
achieve a limited amount of resources on Earth. So let's say that we peak on Earth. We can't get any better because all of our resources are currently being recycled. We can't use any more power to take those resources. Otherwise, we'll run out of them. Let's say they're all renewable, and if we cut them out too quickly, they're gone forever. Here's the thing. If you have reached your peak and you can expand somewhere else, why wouldn't you? And especially to a place, not saying like Mars, considering Mars is celestial.
Oh my God, it's so
there.
bad.
But consider Mars like the plains of America if there were no Native Americans. That's the comparison
That's exactly the
being
thing
made.
that's irritating.
If there
to me
were
is it's
Martians and we were
if
like,
there were
like,
Martians,
colonize
sure.
Mars, sure. Who gives a shit? I wouldn't support them going to Mars to, take
I wouldn't
over.
say go to Mars and take over the Martians in their primitive states of life, but
At the same time, honestly, to goodness, there's no real reason not to.
you know what I'm actually surprised about? This is definitely a tangent, but I'm really surprised that the scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye haven't tried to revoke the laws regarding space, because the fundamental law regarding space is that it is the Commonwealth of Man, that none of us can own it.
Exactly.
But
Which
the
is why I
problem
think it's
with
really
that-
fucking stupid that they're like, oh, well, they just think that they can just own Mars and whatever. Well, they can't. Because that would make you a pirate.
Well, what I think is interesting to me is that all of them oppose the Mars One experiments that Elon Musk is trying to propose. And the reasoning why is because they believe that there's some sort of life form inside of the ice on Mars, and they want to be able to find that and study it. And Elon Musk is going to colonize Mars, and they're worried that it would destroy that ice, and so on and so forth. First of all, I don't even know that that's necessarily true, that it would destroy the ice. But even if it would, right? Why is a
It's
microbial worth more to you?
Than the lives of humans. Well, see, here's the thing, is that there literally doesn't have to be a fucking compromise here. Like, seriously, just send the people to, like, you can pay them. Like, they're like, say, hey, we have a concern as scientists, we're very interested in life on other planets, it's a big thing that humans have always been interested in.
Just don't dig
You're
to
going
this
to go-
depth, and we'll give you...
No, see, here's the thing, is that you don't even have to do that. You can say, dig as much as you fucking want. Here's the thing, we'll fund you, we will help you go to Mars, on the condition that once you get there, you send us back samples of the ice from Mars so we can study the microbials. Or you allow us to bring scientists who will guide the digs so that we can harvest as much of this ice as possible so that we can study it. See, it's like you literally don't have to make a compromise here where it's like, well, we want to leave Mars untouched so that we can eventually study its life. You're not going to be able to study its life if you leave it untouched. It's simply not the case. Like,
All right, so then but again, this impulse to enter the space race isn't the embodiment of the American spirit of invention or
It literally
forward-thinking
is.
entrepreneurship. Neither it is driven by the kind of nationalistic Cold War fervor. Rather, the impulse to colonize lands, to colonize people, and now that we might be technologically capable of doing so, colonizing space, has its origins in gendered power structures. Entitlement to power, control, domination, and ownership. See, here's the thing, right? If you believe in this socially type of masculinity, right? In terms of social masculinity is an inherently anti-entitlement ideology. If you cannot prove yourself as a male through masculine conventions, such as hard work, such as violence, such as merit,
sacrifice.
then you are
Are a
not a
selfish
man
pussy.
in the eyes of these people. These
Which-
people who are
let's
staunch
be
supporters,
honest,
like
let's
the
be
MAGA
honest.
cats and so on and so forth, they would not call a man who believes that he's entitled to whatever he wants and doesn't actually do anything. They wouldn't say, if there was some guy who was born into wealth, an old money kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't say to that kid, oh, yeah, dude, you're totally a man. They'd be like, no, you're a pussy boy. You're a
You've
twink.
never had to
You've
fight for
never had to
anything in
fight
your
for
life."
anything. You have no masculinity. You have no strength. You are not a man. And that's exactly what irritates me, is that they think they have
And
their
it's-
own
it's
social
part-
definition of what
Part
man
of a
is.
real attempt to oppress men into sacrificing themselves, because that's the real crime here, is the way that men are exploited by governments and institutions as expendable.
What bothers
Because
me
women
the
are not
most is that I
expendable
don't
because
even
they
understand
carry the
what their
babies.
ideology's basis is because they talk so much about the socially defined masculinity, but they don't actually use traditional or social masculine roles, because traditional
Exactly.
social masculine roles are based upon merit. So there is no such thing as male entitlement if you believe that
That men are better suited to a certain position, which
It's-
they are.
If you say
That's
that,
the thing
oh,
about
men
and women
are
is that they are equal and that they are complementary to each other.
It's like, oh, look at that rich guy. He's got such male entitlement. Well, here's the
He's
two
not
things that
entitled because
here's the
he's
two
male, I can
options,
assure you
right?
that.
He's got old money, and in that case, he is entitled. But most men like most hyper-masculine guys like MGTOWs, like the Proud Boys, would not consider him to be a masculine figure because he's never had to work for anything, or he's new money and he had to work his ass off to get that money. And in that case, yes, he is a man, but he's not entitled. He's a worker.
Exactly. So
the concept of entitlement is that you believe that you deserve something that you haven't worked for.
To have worked for.
Masculinity has always favored the person who works
selflessly
and demonized the person who refuses to. It think of all of the stereotypical really masculine characters. Think of Red Foreman, how much he hates communists and hippies. The reason why he hates those things isn't because of the conception of the political ideology or the wars or so on and so forth.
They're lazy.
And that's exactly the thing,
hard.
is that's my problem, is I don't care about, for instance, myself. I don't have a good track record with being nice to hippies. I don't mind a hippie. I don't mind environmentalists. I don't even mind ecologists, okay? My issue is that they don't want to do any hard work. They don't want to actually try to make the world better. They just want to force everyone else to.
Yes.
And that's my issue, is that I want to help the environment too, but we can't just make oil and fossil fuels illegal. We have to come up with a genuine alternative that works. You know what that is? Nuclear energy, but you're afraid of that too, aren't you, you fucking hippie? Anyways, sorry, Mom, I love you.
No opinions, rip.
All right.
Anyway, the Friday before SpaceX's launch, legendary astronaut Buzz Aldrin reiterated to me over lunch that it is imperative that we talk about space exploration in the terms of migration rather than using words like colonize or settle when talking about going to Mars.
I actually definitely agree with that. I would say settle is okay.
Well, yeah, see, that's
settle
the thing.
doesn't seem bad.
Here's the thing, is that when birds go south for the winter because the conditions in the north are bad, it's not called colonization. Despite the fact that they are invading those species of birds who always live in the south.
Wow, through a feminist lens, Aldrin's deliberate word choice revealed an important reality of the space race. This 21st century form of imperialism is the direct result of men giving up on the planet they have all but destroyed. But literally it's not. But literally every single one of the people who's funding private space industry does not want to leave Earth permanently. They just want to make it more and more capable for us to travel to other planets and colonize them so that we don't feel limited by the resources by which we are confined. We as humans have altered and destroyed and created...
The very presence of race as a concept is a testament to this. Literally, different races on Earth are theorized to have existed because we decided that just living in mid-northern Africa wasn't good enough for us as a species, so we moved. It is not a patriarchal idea. It is a human idea. It is an animal idea to move to a place when
the raping and pillaging of the earth and the environmental chaos that doing so has unleashed are integral to the process of colonization, and the connection of the treatment of Mother Earth to women is more than symbolic. Study after study has shown that climate change globally affects women more than men. All right, so they linked 3 articles, and let's just go through.
Oh my god.
Here are 4 ways consequences of climate change differ by gender.
Farmers with small holdings in Africa will be among those most severely affected by global warming, argues a report published this week by the advocacy group for agriculture for impact. That's because changes in weather and temperature are expected to reduce crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa, making it more difficult for farmers, many of whom are already poor, to feed their families. And most of those farmers happen to be women. Women wake up. Women make up
respect 45%
to 80% of the food producing workforce in developing countries, according to the United Nations Women's March.
First point here, I'm going to say it's probably 45%.
Yeah,
I think that if your population of workers is 80% women, where are the men?
Dying in wars, Ash. Dying. Because it's not like the men are just sitting on their asses doing nothing. They're also working. The difference is that the women are doing the farm work because that's what they're suited to be able to do.
Around the world, women and girls are more likely to be responsible for gathering water and fuel for fires than their families.
Yes, because the
water,
men are killing
yes.
each other.
Water, yes. Fuel, no.
Yeah.
Fuel is definitely a masculine thing.
As in, like, the 4 of the 5 most highly paying jobs in the entire world are dominated by men, and pretty much all of them have to do with fuel science and fuel economics.
Okay, I'm not gonna read that anymore.
Oh my fucking god! It literally said that it's more likely to cause global disasters like hurricanes and whatnot, and it says that if women
It'll
aren't in the
affect
same-
women more because in third countries they're
if women aren't in the same economical status as men, they're more likely to be harmed.
they're less likely to have been trained how to swim. Okay, explain to me how swimming is gonna help you in a hurricane.
Explain to me how swimming is going to help you in an earthquake.
It doesn't. Okay. Anyways, women in developing countries are particularly vulnerable.
To climate change. It's highly dependent on. Wait, go back up.
No, I'm not reading that. We already read that. This means that while men compete with each other over whose rock is the biggest and send playthings off to become flashy space junk, women around the world are fighting to stay alive against violent assaults on their neighborhood and their planet.
Researchers have found evidence that people perceive consumers who behave in eco-friendly ways as more feminine, and that those consumers perceive themselves as more feminine.
Because the eco-friendly ways are typically inactive, and we typically see women as taking a more passive role in society. That's not to say women can't take an active role. That's not the point. It's not supposed to be a sexist thing. It's that, for instance, in Scandinavia and in the Netherlands, where gender discrimination laws are so strict that women and men have to be treated equally, and they have to be treated based upon their actions. Women, statistically, have taken 80% of all women, 84%, have actually taken themselves out of the workplace permanently to stay home with their families, to stay home with their children, to be a stay-at-home mom. The thing is that when women are left to their own devices, they take...
That women can make that decision.
For instance, the whole wage gap thing. The reason why women make less money is because women work less hours. And that's fine. In fact, I would encourage men to take less hours.
See, that's the thing, is that even those 77% to the dollar things that they talk about, even still, we still misunderstand the statistic, because it's not, all women and all men who work. It's all men and all women, of which less women work, because in some countries, first of all, they're not allowed to work. In some countries, they just decide not to, like, for example, what you just mentioned, because they don't have to, because they don't want to.
And this is exactly my point, is that it's like, how would I propose that we do away with the gender wage gap? Well, the answer is that I would say...
Just encourage them to do whatever they want.
I would encourage men to take less hours and more people to join the workplace, because most job places have an 8 to 10 hour day.
Yes.
You could reduce that to a 6 to 8 hour day.
If you reduce that, say you have 4 people in the workplace, they all work 8 hours. Well, if you cut all their hours down to 6, then each one of those 4 has lost, in total 8 hours of work.
Right.
Now you can afford to hire another person.
And your workers are less stressed, and you can afford to pay them more. Exactly. Pay them all 50 cents more, and that still doesn't equivalent to the amount of overtime you have to pay them.
Exactly.
So reduce the amount of hours everyone is working, and then you'll also decrease the amount of fatalities that are associated with men, because a lot of fatalities associated with men are due to stress and sleep deprivation. If you make men stop...
Which reminds me, I should sleep at some point that isn't 4 o'clock in the morning tonight.
Yeah, we'll try to get you to sleep sooner than that. So the biggest concern with me in regards to all this stuff is that the reason why you're perceived as more feminine for being ecologically friendly isn't because femininity is eco-friendly. It's because eco-friendly policies are more passive and less active.
And that's to assume that passive has a negative connotation with it as well.
Right, and that's the thing, is that we're not implying that it is a bad thing. We're just implying that
that's what it's associated with.
That's why it has that association. It's because I would personally be against active ecological movement, because what that would most likely mean is enforcement by government.
Exactly.
And so I have no problem with people recycling and installing solar panels and all that stuff. You go ahead. In fact, I support you. I hope you do more of that.
In fact, I think we should continue to invest in solar energy, because we're getting close, actually.
Right.
Potentially. Basically, for those of you who don't know, right now solar panels are only about 20% efficient, in that of the energy that hits them, they can only capture 20% of it. Well, the idea we recently, somebody discovered that he was able to create luminescent crystals of almost every single color on the spectrum of color, within a certain range. What this would mean is that instead of having 20% of the energy, which, of course, is cut down even more by the fact that you have to cool the solar panels and, turn them off for a time and everything like that, the idea that we could have these multicolored crystals instead, because, of course, anything that glows in the dark is glowing because it has absorbed light previously, and the reason it glows a specific color is because it captured light of a specific frequency. So the idea is that you could capture 80% with these spectrum of crystals instead of 20%, which would basically remove the criticism of solar energy as being inefficient because it doesn't capture very much energy at all. So go ahead, continue to invest in solar panels because that's cool. That works. That's fine. Just make it good first.
All right, so the final thing, or not the final thing, but another thing here is it says that men are insecure about their masculinity and their environmental conscious is actually correlated because caring for the planet is perceived to be feminine and the psychology of toxic masculinity spills over the unethical disregard for the environment. Well, first of all, I sincerely doubt that. Like, genuinely, you didn't actually source that. You sourced the fact that women are more environmentally conscious, but you didn't actually source something that says that the majority of men reported that it was because they didn't want to be perceived as being feminine. Second of all, you could be environmentally friendly and be active, be the masculine role. So that's not a valid argument even if it was true. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's such a thing as extreme masculinity, the same thing as there's an extreme of femininity.
Well, see, that's the thing is that, I don't even necessarily disagree that masculinity can be toxic. It's just that the denial that also exists in women is just not a thing. And I can actually give a personal example. Women like control and power just as much as men do in certain contexts. I can prove it from anecdotal experience, which is, of course, the only thing that liberals bother to appreciate, because it's all about what happened to me, because it doesn't matter what the statistics say, it's about me. But whatever the case, women can like power, and I can tell you just how much they like power.
Quite a bit.
Yeah, quite a bit. It's to this day still a part of who I am and the way that I think. So
this masculine insecurity.
Yeah, masculine insecurity
is everywhere.
Sure. Does feminine insecurity exist, Ash?
That's just called internalized misogyny.
Exactly.
That's just
only
called
men
internalized.
can do anything wrong.
Because if a woman is doing something wrong, it's because men have poisoned her. That's the answer.
Exactly.
Trump himself has spoken about making sure our nuclear bomb is bigger and more powerful than can often be found, bragging about how he's going to build a beautiful, great wall. Right now, there is a robot dummy propped up in the driver's seat of a red Tesla convertible flying through space away from the man-made garbage fires devouring Earth.
Houston, we have a problem. And it's the patriarchy.
You know what the problem is? That you took a gender studies course instead of going into ecological science.
Yeah.
Because maybe then you could have an opinion on this.
Oh, no, you're literally right. Marcy Bianco is a writer and the editorial and communications manager of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University.
What is gender research? Can someone explain this to me? I don't even mean this ironically. I literally mean, what is gender research? Because I understand gender politics. Okay, I understand having a degree in women's studies or gender politics. Okay, what is gender research?
Well, it's about the way that we as humans perceive gender.
No. There's no such thing. This is something that's actually funny. Is I espouse something that most leftists actually say they espouse, but they actually don't, and that's gender nihilism. I don't think gender exists. I don't think it's an actual thing. I think that the concept of it is dumb. So when someone says to me, Oh, and the reasoning is because I used to believe it. Like, there's some, like, the idea that women are more likely to do these traits and men are more likely to do those traits used to infuriate me. But it's the truth. I've seen now, over and over again, with all these societies where it's like, hey, we're going to give men and women equal rights. You can do whatever you want, and it's fine. Well, when they're actually left to their devices, they do different things, and they do what is typically traditionally masculine. That's not to say they can't. It's just to say that it's uncommon. It's uncommon for them to be outside of that. It's not wrong to be outside of that. You shouldn't feel ashamed if you're not a hyper-masculine or hyper-feminine person.
Because it doesn't matter. Because it's just what we commonly associate with people of a specific sex.
Anyways, so that was this article on the patriarchal race to colonize Mars. Alright, and then at the end of this, there's a vote that says, do you think humans should colonize other planets?
Let's get into the statistics of this. 4% of people decided not to vote at all. 4% of people said, no, we would destroy other planets as we did ours. And 92% of people said, yes, we should explore life elsewhere.
To put that in perspective, this is from 7,425 votes. And this was made by an NBC. I didn't realize this didn't have comments. Would have liked to see what people thought about this.
Yeah, and the gender studies major sure would not have.
But this... He wrote an article about... She wrote this article about how colonizing Mars and wanting to travel space is just patriarchy and male entitlement. And her own viewer base... disagreed by a 92-8 margin.
Yes.
That is one of the best things I've seen in my entire life. It's really great. It's just 4% were like, this is so dumb, I'm not even going to participate. 4% of them were like, you're right, patriarchy. We will destroy those planets.
Destroyed Earth because it's already gone, guys. We already destroyed this planet.
And 92% were like, yeah, we should definitely explore life elsewhere.
Yeah, it's like I don't really give a shit about going to colonize Mars. I think it's a bad idea for us to try and live there. But to say that we just
it allows you to lean towards a specific amount.
Yeah.
So these people actually
they
are more no than yes, but they're still in the middle. Okay.
That doesn't change the fact that 92% of the people who read the fucking article and actually bothered to respond are on the left side, on the green that we should.
So, that was the last topic we had for today. It was a long 2 hours and 20 minutes of conversation where we just talked about net neutrality and why we don't like it, and espionage, and why, even though that might not be true, if it is true, it's really funny.
Which extended into a conversation about actual
espionage and why we shouldn't get involved in trying to help other countries because we're just perceived as being imperialistic when we're not, and when we typically are imperialistic, we don't even do so successfully. We talked about unions and how you should have the right to say no to a union, and you should have the right to choose different unions, and how unions aren't necessarily bad. It's just that you don't get a choice.
It's just that the way that they're
We talked about how Justin Trudeau is one of the funniest guys I've ever seen, just because people treat him seriously. We talked about guns because
in a variety of contexts. Really.
We talked about guns in a lot of different ways, and then we talked about why it is not patriarchal to want to travel space, and how women...
Why it is not patriarchal to want to secure a future for oneself.
Why colonization is only wrong if you use force. You can colonize... You could go to a new land with a bunch of savages and say, hey, we're gonna live here. We're gonna colonize this place. Is that okay?
Like, yeah, that's excellent. We've been waiting for some people to exchange culture with.
And that would be fine.
You could teach us a lot, and maybe we could teach you something as well. Who's being exploited there?
So, the end goal of this conversation, you might think, oh wow, it was just 2.5 hours of you guys expressing your opinions. Isn't that what you do in private anyways? Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It
Yes, it
actually
is.
literally is. But
we just
the
thought
broader
that
thing,
it would be great if other people could hear those opinions and we could hear their opinions.
the goal with this is that what's going to happen over the next couple of days is we're going to take care of our normal lives and do that and whatnot. We're not going to set down times that we're going to do each of these. It's going to be basically once all of the material that we've already read about kind of recycles through, in a week or so, people will forget about net neutrality and espionage.
Yeah, they literally will.
And so we'll have something else to talk about. But in the meantime, we'll have this stand up here, and over the next couple of days, we'll cut out the better parts and we'll share those. And the reason we'll do that is just so that
perhaps even separate them into different talks and whatnot.
I'd like to separate them, yes, into different
content.
subjects, and the reason for that is because we've only had a fan base of 2 or 3 people throughout the course of this, and it's mainly been people who already know us. But
ultimately, the more that you produce content, the more other people.
If
can
we
view it,
break
the more
this
other
all
people
down
can share
into
it.
pieces, he's right. We'll have more.
Perhaps
people.
there's somebody who's not.
Maybe someone
doesn't
doesn't want to talk
net
about the
neutrality.
espionage of Cambodia versus the U.S. and Germany, but would like to talk about net neutrality. Or maybe there's someone who really badly hates Justin Trudeau but likes feminism, so they'd like to watch those 2 episodes but nothing else. That's fine. It's entirely your choice. We want to make this as modular as possible. We want to make this as interactive as possible.
Which is why we even bothered to separate them into sections to begin with.
The entire goal of this radio is to have a dialogue about hot topics, issues, and all sorts of different conversations, partisans and non-partisans.
People to share their perspectives.
I want to hear your perspective. We both used to be communists, and now we're not. We'd love to talk to other communists. We'd love to talk to other capitalists. We'd like to talk to free markets.
Because here's the thing.
We'd love to. I don't even.
We're not necessarily right. Correct us if need be.
Yes, just give us your argument. Give us your opinion. Furthermore and foremost, the biggest thing is that we want to know how you feel. We want to know your opinion. We want to know what it is. I don't care where you are. I've had dialogues with communists, with fascists, with Nazis, with liberals and skeptics, and I don't agree with most of them, but I can at least listen to you. I can at least
not to say that no argument has literally zero merit.
No, and that's the thing, is that there are some arguments where I just can't. I hate Nazis, so when I've talked to Nazis, it's really hard for me to respect them. It's really hard for me to let them speak without screaming at them bloody murder.
Yeah, I hate 66% of the American population too.
Stop. Dan Harmon, go. But this will conclude it for our episode of Redblood Radio. Is there anything you want to say, Eain?
Smash the patriarchy. We will not colonize Mars because that is sexist.
Agreed.
Also, I think that it's quite terrible, just considering that despite the fact that in certain contexts they do pretend to advocate for men's rights, where it's like, oh, well, men don't have to behave masculinely, they are also willing to exploit those same damaged and troubled men to push a anti-gun agenda by using their literal suicides as evidence as to why guns are the problem.